All right, so we're talking about revolutions here. We're talking about a revolutionary way to consider consciousness in the universe. So I want to play this little video. This tells you something about me, if in case. How many of you ever heard of me in the audience? 3? Oh, Bill, Matt. I think if you look at your program, I think you can find it. But anyhow, it's about 3 or 4, right? Well, yeah. My wife. Okay, so this video. Oh yeah, Kate knows me. All right, so I'm going to play this video if I know how to. Do I hit something? Oh, you don't have a touch screen here.
You don't have a touch screen.
At the beginning of the 21st century, computers have placed the sum of the world's knowledge into the palms of our hands. Today, any child in any country with a smartphone and an internet connection has access to more information than Jimmy Carter, the president of the wealthiest, most powerful, and technologically advanced country, did when he occupied the White House. This rapid democratization of technology, unprecedented in human history, has not only narrowed the knowledge gap between rich and poor, it has profoundly changed the manner in which we live our lives. From smartphones, laptops, GPS, and video game consoles, to thermostats, coffee makers, and smart speakers, computers have become so ubiquitous we can't imagine our lives without them. And yet, a mere 45 years ago, the length of just half a human lifetime, computers were anything but personal. The high cost associated with their production not only put the computers used by businesses and universities out of reach of most people, but discouraged their use in everyday consumer goods we now take for granted. In fact, like so many things from the 1970s, a decade synonymous with excess, too much pant, too much lapel, too much hair, too much car, and too much head, when it came to computers, there was just too much cost. But by 1974, that was about to change, because that is when a small group of Motorola employees in Phoenix, Arizona, quit their jobs to pursue a dream, to make the world's first affordable microprocessor, one that will put the computing power of the semiconductor within reach of everyone. Together with their families, they make a bold move. They pack up their homes and move across the country to work at a semiconductor design and fabrication company in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, called MOS Technology. There, they begin collaborating with engineers already working at MOS to create an 8-bit microprocessor that is not only smaller and cheaper, but as fast or faster than other, more expensive microchips, a feat they accomplish in less than a year. In 1975, they introduced what is now regarded as one of the most influential microchips ever designed, the MOS 6502, and the world is never the same again. Selling for just a fraction of the cost of its competitors, the 6502 caused rapid decreases across the entire market, spawning a revolution in personal computing. Featured in such seminal computers as the Apple I and II, the Commodore PET and the BCC Micro, as well as the Atari and Nintendo home video game consoles, the 6502 has since become the brains inside toys, office machines, and medical devices too numerous to mention. To date, billions of 6502 family microprocessors have been created, and they are still in production today. So profound was its impact that one chronicler of the computing industry noted, when one particular geek stuck one particular chip into one particular computer circuit board and booted it up, the universe skipped a beat. The geek was Steve Wozniak, the computer was the Apple I, and the chip was the 6502. While the story of Chuck Peddle, the man who conceived of the 6502, and that of Bill Mensch, one of the original design team members, are widely recognized and recorded, the stories of the other engineers and employees who also worked on the 6502 and their contributions are not. Team 6502 seeks to change that. Through personal accounts, or those of family related to the original 6502 design team members, including Terry Holt, Will Mathis, Rod Orgel, Harry Bauckham, Sidney Ann Holt, Walt Eisenhower, and John Pavinen, as well as historical documents including MOS technology brochures, 6502 schematics, interoffice memos, notes from brainstorming sessions, patent awards and 6502 testing procedures and results, Team 6502 tells the stories of the other MOS technology engineers and employees behind the chip that put the transformative power of the microprocessor into everybody's hands. From the moment of its legendary introduction at WESCON, the Western Electronics Show and Convention, almost 5 decades ago, when computer enthusiasts and hobbyists from across Silicon Valley flocked to San Francisco to purchase the 6502, to the legions of computer programmers and historians who continue to debate, discuss, program, and experiment with the iconic chip to this day, 6502's appeal has spanned time and generations. May Team 6502 fan the flame of that enthusiasm by providing new information about the people and processes behind its production, and with it, new food for thought and discussion for those who have carved out a special place in their hearts for the little chip that changed the world.
So bringing it up to date, on February 23rd, this past February 23rd, this was revealed at the Integrated Circuit Conference in San Francisco. This is a whole wafer that's built like this on a piece of glass, and they peel this off, and I have 100 of them that they tested. But these are 6502s that can be powered by radio frequency for RFID on everything in the world. So that's what it's planned for. They're planning trillions of things that use this little processor. I wanted to, that's where I am from. And so the way I look at consciousness is different than, how do we get back to the first? Oh, I know how. So I see the universe through the lens of embedded intelligence. The only reason why you build a microprocessor is to embed intelligence into things. And that's what this little workshop's about. And so when I met Dante a few months ago, and then Stuart after that, I met Stuart through Dante, it changed my world because I didn't relate to consciousness at all until I had a conversation with Dante and Stuart. And what Stuart is talking about with microtubules opened my eyes to how intelligence is embedded in everything in the universe. So let me go through these slides. I'll try to get through the slides quickly without getting sidetracked, because I get sidetracked really easily. So the way I was looking at this is that we're here now in what we call the information age. But if you go backwards to say, where did we come from? There was a time when we were just trying to survive. And then we figured that, hey, we could get a business going if we grew crops and we sold crops to people. Why is this? Oh, probably this is timed probably, right? This is, no, I didn't time it. Okay, all right. So anyhow, what I think of, and we've heard that we're in the information age. However, we're also in the disinformation age, the way I see it, because that's how some people get in power, is they're looking for votes. And if they can tell you a story and you'll vote for them, then that's the way we've always done it. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. However, are we really entering in a dark age of confusion? It would seem so with this multimedia stuff, because it's so easy to join a community of, you could say, false information, and you don't really know if the one that you like is factually correct. So I see this as we're entering the fifth age of understanding. The first four ages were, I don't know, put in a 1,000-page book by John Dealey. He was actually what do they call that? Gosh, I can't think of the name. It's semiotics. He was the president of semiotics. So he relates to things from that standpoint. All right, so let's make sense of the universe, and then we'll look at what is embedded intelligence, uses of embedded intelligence, and then uses of human embedded intelligence, which is especially interesting for all of us. And then, yeah, it's going to do it itself. And then we have a panel discussion, but what I noticed in the first workshop here, the panel can be dispersed around the world these days. So Andrew Maynard is a futurist, and he also is the Associate Dean of the College of Global Futures. So I wanted to tie it into the way we as humans create communities worldwide. And then Ted Humphrey and I have been thought partners for decades. And he's the founding dean of the Honors College at ASU. And then you know Dante Lauretta. Everybody knows Dante Lauretta. Well, they should. Anyhow, and then Stuart Hameroff. Everyone here knows Stuart Hameroff. For those that don't know Dante Lauretta, he's going to have a talk here, so you'll get to know him. And then I'll have closing remarks. Okay, so some of the characteristics of the universe is the way I look at it, and this is my take on this. It's infinitely large. Ted Humphrey and I have talked about that many times. So it's infinitely large. It existed forever, which all these things are controversial, existed forever and will exist forever. It began as energy with intelligence, was static for an infinite amount of time. Intelligent, oh, I still have, oh, this is an earlier one. I removed intelligent, got bored, and wanted to know itself. Well, of course, if you're hanging out statically for an infinite amount of time, I think you'd get bored. It wanted to know itself. The universe became dynamic about 15 billion years ago. Now, I'm an engineer, and you're taught engineering approximations, and so I rounded off 14.8 or whatever it is to 15. So, but hey, we're not talking about a trivial amount of time here, so it's not that big of a deal. Okay, so intelligence is characterized as wanting to know itself. So we're here because we want to know something about consciousness. So that's about knowing ourselves through an infinite continuum of levels, which means that it starts with quantum energy. It starts with the very essential piece of information or technology. So quantum energy is in everything. And then we, so beginning with energy quanta, the observed and the observer, everything in itself is conscious. Now, everything in itself is something that I think Kant or some of the other philosophers coined as being the thing in itself, which you could say that the thing in itself is another way of saying embedded intelligence. So this answers the hard problem. What I'm saying there is the hard problem of consciousness is the problem of explaining why. And I just explained why. We wanted to know ourselves and how we have qualia or phenomenal experiences. Well, it's about sensing, processing, communicating, and actuating within itself to be itself, and with others, therefore creating consciousness in and of all things, especially oneself. And the infinite universe has an embedded intelligence. Likewise, all things have an embedded intelligence to self-assemble. That's a key thing. It has to self-assemble to be the thing in itself, the noumenon. The theory of embedded intelligence is a revolution in the use of human embedded intelligence to SPCA. So in case you were wondering, there's a person that studied and wrote and taught at MIT, I think, is where he did his work. But he studied, Thomas S. Kuhn studied and wrote the book, The Structure of scientific revolutions. Almost, and he writes on page 90 of the 3rd edition, he writes, almost always the men and women who achieve these fundamental inventions of a new paradigm have been either very young or very new to the field whose paradigm they change. I'm very new to the field of consciousness. So I can just say what I'm going to say because I don't know what I'm doing in the consciousness world, but I see a lot of science going on here. And I'm an engineer, so I want to learn from Dante and Stuart and others because I want to apply it, but this is how I would apply it. So human embedded intelligence technology, that's what I do. That's my living. I've been designing that since 1971 when I graduated from the University of Arizona College of Engineering and started work at Motorola. So I call embedded intelligence technology microprocessor technology for embedding intelligence in everything you want to perform the task you want it to perform. So this is the slide that's not, if it escapes me, I was going to point out. This is a 16-bit microprocessor that was used in the Apple IIgs and the Super Nintendo. This is 4K bytes of program memory. That's another 4K bytes. This is 256 bytes of RAM, 256 bytes and 64 bytes. This is 4 UARTs. This is 8 timers. This is a parallel interface. What's around here is the way you connect to all things. That could connect to an infinite number of things. It's up to the creativity of the human that wants to apply it. Like that was applied by Apple Computer for the Apple IIgs, and it was applied by Nintendo for the Super Nintendo, as an example. So every phenomenon in the universe uses quantum energy forms and atomic structures of chemical elements as technology for self-assembly into stable observable states. Every one of the infinite number of phenomena in the universe has an operating system that is a monitor to self-assemble. So you can imagine, you have to use your imagination to imagine what that operating system might do to just form a photon that's going to fly across the universe a few billion years and stay together. And that's the quantum unit of gravitational energy, magnetic energy, and electric energy. So those 3 quantum units have to stay together for a photon to leave a star to our eyes. Every one of these infinite number of phenomena in the universe has an operating system. Including living and non-living. Every living phenomenon has an operating system, which is again can be called a monitor at birth that provides the intelligence for how to survive. This is there is a characteristic of intelligence to collectively survive and evolve as a species. This was written up by Joseph Campbell in his study of mythologies. And I have some of this online. All of this is online, so you can see it later. I have a link each at the end of this. I don't know if every one of you can get a digital copy of this, but it might be valuable if you wanted one. But anyhow, that means that the first thing that a living thing has to do is figure out how to survive. Then what's interesting about living things, like this virus, which is living, but it's not even a full cell, right? It's wanting to survive as a species, and that's why it duplicates itself. So that's what we know all living things want to do, and that's the basic intelligence of the living thing. So what Dante and I have been discussing, and probably will discuss later, is that transition from non-living to living, or abio to bio. So I can talk a little bit about quantum units of energy, But all of these smart things that we have in our pockets are built on quantum information. So the way these work is that you actually control electrons flowing in logic gates that we create as semiconductor engineers. So the actual the actual electrons flow through what we call the N-channel transistor that we can turn on, turn off with voltage. So the electrons are gated for going to 0. So when you want to go to a 1, so we're just talking classic here, classic computing. So you have a 1 or a 0. The 1s are all created by P-channel transistors, which actually control holes. Now, what's interesting, a hole in a semiconductor semiconductor material flows about 2.5 times the speed of electrons. So what that reveals itself in all of my designs is that the P-channel transistor is 2.5 times wider than the N-channel transistor. So you have the same speed to a 1 as you have to a 0. It's just the way that we engineers apply the sciences. And in this case, those are quantum units of energy. Actually, the hole is a missing electron that travels slower than a real electron. So this is how I relate to quantum energy and quantum units of energy and quantum computing. So quantum computing, I'm not a quantum computing expert, but what I do know is that the little bit I know about it is that it can have any value between a 0 and a 1, which means that it has an infinite number of values it can be until it objectively reduces to a 1 or a 0. So in our brains, in our neurons, and in our microtubules, we convert them to a 0 or a 1, and I now can use those to talk to you today and find the button to get my slide back to the one I want. So that's how this whole thing works. And so when you look at it and the capability of the human, it's just phenomenal. I mean, that's another use of that word, but it's just amazing how much we can do with what we have in our bodies. The other thing that's important to know, we're part of nature. We're not different than nature. We're part of nature. And the way I relate to these computers here is I think of this as a beaver's lodge in the middle of a lake. Somebody, way back when, the beaver figured out that the wolves were going to eat them and they're little ones, and they decide they're going to build a lodge in the middle of the lake rather than on the shore. They probably started out on the shore because it's kind of easy, but that's the embedded intelligence. That's the technology of a beaver. This is the technology of a human. Okay, so there's naturally occurring atomic structure. So this is the uses of embedded intelligence at the atomic level. So interestingly enough, there are only 94 unique elements in the universe. And I think Dante's saying that's all there are. There aren't any more. There's not any more on the asteroids or in the asteroid belt. They're all 94 that we find here on Earth, which is just fascinating. Of all the infinite number of possibilities, how come there are only 94? Okay, so then we humans figured out that we can blast them apart. So we can just take them all apart. And so we figured out that we could make another 24 elements in nuclear reactors, particle accelerators, and explosions of atomic bombs. So we can tear them all apart, but nature put them together to begin with. I don't know if there is a work at creating new elements that are stable. Those 24 are unstable. So I know that the University of Chicago, which interestingly enough, they had a nuclear reaction under the campus. I don't know who authorized that, but I don't know that I'd want to do that, but they did that. So anyhow, they have their first, about a half a dozen years ago, they had their first engineering department at the University of Chicago. Now they have about 90 Nobel laureates related to University of Chicago. What's interesting is the first engineering department at the University of Chicago is molecular engineering. So they're trying to put together molecules that don't apparently occur in nature. Okay, so then we're going to go to the cell level. So we have a cell level embedded intelligence. The heart pacemaker cell is what starts our heart beating. If our heart wasn't beating, the blood wouldn't flow. And I think it's fascinating that that there is such a cell. I mean, the embedded intelligence concept every day is a wow day for me, because I've been thinking about this for about 25 years. So this isn't just last week I came up with these ideas, and I've been bouncing this off of a philosophy professor, Ted Humphrey. He claims for 17 years. I thought it was about 12 years with him, but he claims 17 years. So what we do as humans, as engineers, trying to apply the physics, what we know about the sciences and the technology that we have available, we created a pacemaker cell. I mean, a pacemaker to replace the pacemaking cell that naturally is in our hearts. So that, I call that the most personal computing. So you have personal computers, and I'm calling that the most personal computing. There are millions of people walking this planet with the 6502, keeping them alive, one heartbeat at a time. I get emotional talking about that. So moving on. So then I look at the stem cell, which creates the living thing, like the human. Starts, they call it a zygote. It's a cell from the mother, cell from the father, and then you're animating energy. So you had to have an intelligence to want to be you. And that's what we find in everything that wants to stay alive. And so that stem cell creates your body, the technology that you can then grow and learn at a university like Arizona or these other universities that attend this consciousness conference. And then we as humans have something similar to that in the form of the sciences that we study, nature that we figure out, and then we create technology to help augment what we can do. And then we have math as another part of the way we understand our world. And when you put it all together, it's a practical application of science, technology, and math. So then the evolution of life, we know from Darwin and others. And then we have our embedded intelligence technology has evolved. So now we have faster, more powerful, more memory. I mean, my phone has like 256 gigabytes of memory just in this little phone I have here. My notebook over here has a terabyte of memory on it, and so I can download all the Zoom calls and everything. I never run out of memory. So then I take it to the next level, which is the community level. So I show you a naturally occurring beehive, and I compare that to a university. So you have similar kinds of characteristics about our communities. Now, you know, we can go to the country level, we can go to world level, as in the United Nations. So the individual human embedded intelligence can be thought of as a bounded infinity. A human bounded infinity can produce an infinite number of possible embedded intelligence uses and outcomes. So now we talk about human embedded intelligence use cases. And what my wife, Diane, who's sitting back there, and I started the Mensch Foundation for supporting scholarship at colleges of engineering. First at College of Engineering at the University of Arizona. Then we have 6 Mensch prizes at Arizona State University and 6 at the University of Arizona Franke Honors College. So the 6 areas of interest at these honors colleges include engineering and applied sciences, social sciences, humanities, physical sciences, biological sciences, fine and performing arts. Now, the University of Arizona wanted more flexibility in these, so they they can pick 6 from anywhere at the University of Arizona, any area of study. So then I thought I'd put up here the 6 Nobel Prizes. So we want these guys to compete for these. The Nobel Prizes in physics, chemistry, physiology, or medicine, literature, peace, and economics. So now I'll, if I can keep it there, I'd say opening it to questions now. Dante, you and I are going to probably have, we're probably going to have some other conversations up here, right? So is there anyone that has some questions there from the audience? Venture up there. Ah, there you go. You're welcome. Okay. Yeah. No. I agree that there was probably a Big Bang.
Okay. Do you believe that there was a prior state to matter that we know of?
Well, what I'm describing here is that the prior state was energy.
Okay. Is energy embedded intelligence?
No, energy plus embedded intelligence.
Okay. Because in the cosmological viewpoint, there was a Big Bang.
Right.
There was a sea of energy that
Right.
condensed into our particles.
Right.
Particles became generating things like stars. The first generation, they were hydrogen, helium. They collapsed. They began nucleosynthesis to create these other elements that you 98 naturally occurring.
Right.
Well, how does embedded intelligence incorporate the genesis of the elemental periodic table?
Okay. Good question. So the way I look at it is energy, when we break apart these atomic structures like a proton, when we crash them together, and at this point, we have like 220, and maybe there's more now. I haven't kept track of it. 220 unique things, that's what they've identified, let's say in a proton. So now you'd say, okay, so why are there 220 unique things in a proton? So why are they there? So then that's the question that I would say when this cosmology look at the particles after the Big Bang, my question is, where did the particles come from? So how did we get particles? So if we can say that a wave packet can become a particle, that might be what we're talking about when we have objective reduction. What is that? That's a 1 or 0 if we thought of it that way, but that 1 or 0 is actually now no longer a wave packet, but now a particle that can be represented by the math of the wave function, or now the particle itself. So that's the beginning of matter, all matter. So what I'm saying then is that this Big Bang, the reason why I say that the Big Bang, I don't believe in the Big Bang, but I can believe in a Big Bang. First of all, where did all the stars come from? So we had a conversation last night at dinner saying that, does the sun have an embedded intelligence? My answer to that is absolutely, it has to. How does it self-assemble? What's causing it to self-assemble? Now, what the Greeks called, they called it the sun god. So I don't want to be using a mythological character called God in this talk. Ted talked me out of that, first of all. Ted said, don't go there with the God thing. And so to me, I'm just using embedded intelligence to be what some people might say that was God created everything. Well, okay, that's a way of looking at it. That's a very interesting way of looking at it. And if you can think of that as a higher power that created you and me, well, that means that I can blame it on God for all of the stuff that goes wrong with me. But I don't want to do that. I want to own me. In order to own me, I have to own all of me. I have to own all of the quantum units of energy, all the atomic structures, all the cell structures, everything in me. When I look at it that way, I'm empowering myself. to be all I can be. And that's what I'm saying is to each of you, what are you doing with your bounded infinity? And if you look at it that way, you look at the world in a different lens. You look at the world as everything is in all. Everything is beautiful. Beauty is the energy of attraction. Love is the energy of attraction. You see how love and beauty kind of go together? So all of this I can translate within this theory of embedded intelligence. Another question? Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear.
So you brought up the paper for, I can't remember it exactly, structured to scientific, destructured to scientific revolutions.
Right.
I came across this paper as I was investigating this all-encompassing thing related to the Gestalt or Gestalt psychologies, like later went into the use of language, how you use it to your word usage, like in semiotics, like as you described, for example, take a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being bad, 10 being good, label 1 through 10 with other words. The words that you choose are going to, I sort of understood through this, build your paradigm, which you interpret the world, you interpret things as beautiful, you gain attention to certain things, depending upon the things that you're familiar with. I was wondering, have you delved into these types of areas, like the importance of semiotics in terms of using language, the media that you choose to channel your language through, or the example, the words you choose and how that impacts your interpretation of the things that guide your attention towards the tasks you choose to do, towards the things that you choose to work on, etc. I don't know. I wanted to know what you had to say about that very wide set of topics.
Yeah, I used a phrase with Ted recently. Now, Ted has orders of magnitude more words. His favorite dictionary is the Oxford Unabridged or whatever it's called that you have to have a subscription to. He loves words. He's a gifted word crafter. He's just a joy to talk with because he introduces me to all new words. So actually, one day when I was trying to figure out how to use the word wildcat in a sentence, I went through this online dictionary. I got to number 21. It was the one that I wanted to use in the sentence I was creating. And it went on after that. So I don't know how many definitions of wildcat there are, but you can see where if I were a computer, I'd say, let's number them. And so it's wildcat number 1, wildcat number 2, wildcat number 3, and then we'd be communicating. So this idea of semiotics is signs, and that every living thing can relate to signs. Somehow these little guys can figure out that it's time for me to split. I mean, not split and leave, but split. So how does it figure that out? And then all the other little things like a housefly, which can go upside down, backwards, forward, escaping the fly swatter. I mean, those kinds of things they can recognize. So that's the semiotics of all of these living things. And where it comes to humans, I mean, come on, give me a break. Each language is a bounded infinity. So French, English, Russian, German, Chinese, Japanese, all of those, you can translate them, but you're never going to get exactly what was meant by that sign or those symbols if you're talking about Chinese or Japanese where they use symbols. So to me, what you're bringing up here is how did we get so complicated, and why do we have to stay in school or want to stay in school from about birth until what? We're 22, and then we graduate from a college usually. And then you go on, you want to get another 8 years to be a doctor, medical doctor. I mean, we're having to load up our microtubules, which Dante and well, Stuart introduced me to. So to me, we have a whole lot of microtubules in there. And I don't know if you noticed that I mispronounced some things. So my microtubules are wearing out, and they're saying they're breaking up, I guess. And Dante and Stuart ought to figure out how to get them back together again. The sooner the better. And so Jay is doing some workshops on using sonar or audio waves to be able to help you with some things that you're misusing your information that you've stored or whatever. So you see, as humans, we have this unlimited, infinite capability to be all we want to be, but we're bounded by, well, I grew up in the wrong community, or I chose these parents, and these parents have caused me a lot of things to think about. And that's a gift.
Yeah.
It's what you do with that crisis or that trauma. And that's what's in that book. The structure of scientific revolutions frequently comes from a crisis. And I don't know what crisis. And I didn't read the whole book, but I found some passages in there because I got a used book and somebody underlined all these things.
Yeah.
So whoever,
I didn't read the whole book either.
so whoever owned it before me had some really good things they were looking at, and they helped me through some of it so I could get back to Ted and say, hey, I got the book. That is interesting. So he's the one that introduced me to that structure of scientific revolutions, because he saw what we were talking about for 15 years is he now wants to do, and what you'll see in the video, if we have time to play it after we have Dante and Stuart show up here, and we have a discussion about things, but we could talk for the next 10 hours on the topic. So did I answer your question?
Yeah, I asked a lot of things, and I appreciate all the input you gave.
Okay, thank
So
you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any more? There you go.
It's just a quick question. You seem optimistic about like the Internet of Thing revolution with RFID chips being present in all the things on the planet. I'm wondering just what your take is on how that's going to help resolve like the scientific predictions of an increasingly unlivable planet from climate change. And you seem concerned about like disinformation. So like in regards to that, do you think that kind of the gains from the Internet of Things are just going to negate any of those concerns?
Well, I could be concerned about a lot of things. I choose not to be. I choose to be happy. I choose to be, what did Jay talk about in the previous one? He was talking about basically awake and aware. But I tend to look at the positive things and not the negative things. It's just like nuclear energy is a good thing, but nuclear explosions to disintegrate things, I don't think that's a good idea. So if you look at the infinite number of possibilities, like for instance, in a quantum computer, when you say that that has an infinite number of possibilities before it objectively reduces within our brains, within our technology of our bodies, it's a crapshoot unless you're going to orchestrate a good outcome. And I'm saying I'd rather look at orchestrating a good outcome than a bad outcome. We know there's bad actors. There will always be bad actors. We all have, the good actors have to figure out how to be protective of their interests. And it doesn't mean we're always right. It doesn't mean we're always morally correct, but you'll see is Ted is now trying to come up with a values neutral foundation for moral, political, and social theories, which all these philosophers, that's what they love talking about, all these kind of things. And there's a lot of words you can use there. So to come back to your question about the Internet of Things, I have some technology up here. I showed you that one. This has an infinite number of things you can hook to it. So there's a couple of sensors there. Those are radios. One's a GPS radio. One's a Wi-Fi and Bluetooth radio. Here's a little OLED display. You see these big screens? Well, this is a little screen. But you can plug in about 1,000 things you can buy right now for plugging into this thing. There's a serial way you can plug into all of these little sensors, and it's called I2C. It's an integrated interface for integrated circuits. And so you can hook up thousands of things to this thing. And so this is the IoT. This is the platform for IoT. And so do I have faith in humanity? Yes. Do I think it's going to be misused, bad acting? Yes. But that doesn't prevent us from doing something beneficial for mankind. It's just that you have to be awake and aware. Conscious is a word here we can use here. You have to be conscious. That means we have to sense a bad actor. We have to process what that means. We have to communicate among ourselves, hopefully, and not just go off one at a time and road rage or something. And then the next thing you want to actuate. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? How are you going to respond to that? Some people had some things to say about that in Philadelphia a couple hundred years ago, right? So in other words, to not do something because someone's going to misuse it or bad act with it, I think there are some things, and there's always a debate about just because we can do it doesn't mean we should do it. But there's some things here that if you do it right, and if Ted can find the words to communicate the values neutral foundation for moral, political, and social theory, which right now he has COVID and he's on the Danube, and that's why he's not here. But he just got COVID, and his friend got COVID. Yes. Ted Humphrey is the founding dean of Barrett, the Honors College at ASU. Not all, but many of the honors colleges in America are built on the concepts that he created at Arizona State University. You're welcome. Okay, so you're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you. So this thing went ahead. I don't know how that got timed in there. I didn't either.
I think I'll go. Stuart's here.
Yeah.
And then
All right. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Bill. A little introduction to me. I'm Dante Lauretta. I'm a professor here at the University of Arizona in the Lunar and Planetary Laboratory. I am a cosmochemist, an astrobiologist, and rocket scientist. And I'll be talking about some of that other stuff later this week in the sessions on Thursday. With this topic, so I met Bill, I don't know, 6 months ago or so, I think. I gave a lecture at the U of A Honors College and was talking about my research in origin of life and astrobiology. And some of the things I said piqued his interest, and we started corresponding. And he started telling me about the theory of embedded intelligence. And I wasn't clear, and still not clear exactly what it is, although that was the motivation for having this workshop. We started talking with Stuart. I started talking with Stuart independently, trying to understand the role of consciousness and the origin of life. And the three of us got together, and we thought we would put our ideas out here and see what crystallizes. So when Bill asked me to participate in a panel on embedded intelligence, my response was, I'll talk about intelligence the way astrobiologists talk about intelligence, and then we'll see where we might have some common ground or where there might be some fruitful areas of growth and scientific productivity. So usually when I give a presentation, I like to frame it in the form of a question. When we look at it from astrobiology, astrobiology is interested in a couple different things. First of all, the origin of life on Earth, the evolution of life on Earth, and then seeking evidence for life elsewhere in the solar system, in the galaxy, and maybe even throughout the universe. So in order to do that, we need to understand how life on Earth evolved, and intelligence plays a large role in that. So I start out with some definitions. Bill's talking about embedded intelligence. I'm going to start with intelligence because these are not always that easy to define. So I started with a collective definition. 52 experts signed a document that said this is what we think the definition of intelligence is. And they said it was the ability to reason, plan, solve problems. The emphases are mine. Think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly, and learn from experience. If we just go to standard dictionaries or encyclopedias, we get similar ideas, the ability to adapt effectively to the environment, either by making a change in oneself, by changing the environment, or finding a new one. And similarly, intelligence is the ability to learn, understand, or to deal with new or trying situations, and a little bit of ode to philosophy, the skilled use of reason. Another discipline that deals with intelligence and measures intelligence, it's specifically in humans, is psychology, but they have some similar concepts that arise here. So if we look at the psychologist definitions, one thing as an astrobiologist I like is they bring in the concept of an organism. And this is where Bill and I have a lot of discussion. I'm trying to understand, and some of the questions that Bill got are related to this. How are things like a star or an atom intelligent? I think intelligence starts at the organism's level, but I'm interested in being convinced otherwise. So the ability of an organism to solve new problems. A person possesses intelligence insofar as he or she has learned or can learn to adjust themselves to their environment. Intelligence is the ability to adapt oneself adequately to relatively new situations in life. So these definitions would bring in biology. And intelligence is part of the internal environment that shows through at the interface between a person and the external environment as a function of cognitive task demands. So that's coming from psychology. The other place where you get a lot of intelligence definitions is in AI. And so now we're moving out of organisms into machines or technology. And so the AI researchers would say that any system that generates adaptive behavior to meet goals in a range of environments can be said to be intelligent. Intelligence measures an agent's ability to achieve goals in a wide range of environments. Intelligence is the ability to process information. It's the first time information theory has showed up in these properly in a complex environment. And intelligence is the ability for an information processing system to adapt to its environment with insufficient knowledge and resources. And so being involved in spacecraft engineering, I also went to system engineering because I think there's some interesting concepts here, because I'm going to wrap all of this into what I think is a single definition that might be applied even in the embedded intelligence realm. So systems are more than just a group of components. They assemble to what's called a unitary whole. And I like this concept a lot in astrobiology. I think it works when you're trying to describe a cell or a multicellular organism. There's something that happens where they become a unitary whole. They have a boundary, sometimes called a Markov blanket, where information goes in and out, and it's processed in the internal system. Its decisions are made, and then the system acts based on that decision using the information, even incomplete information. So systems, through their interaction of their elements, have emergent properties that arise only through the precise way in which their elements are combined. And these emergent properties are greater than the sum of the individual capabilities of the elements. They define the system capabilities that either effectively or ineffectively meet the stakeholders' need. That's a very engineering term. And indeed, systems are found in all realms and are analyzed and defined in all academic disciplines. So if I pull all that together, I would say intelligence is the ability of a unitary whole. So if we're thinking about an embedded intelligence, I would say you need the thing that is defined internally and identifies itself as separate from the external environment. It must process information. It must learn from experience and then solve problems and adapt to its environment. So when we bring that, interestingly, the concept of intelligence comes up in astrobiology and is quite controversial, especially at the cellular level. And this is where in our field, we would say, at best, this is where intelligence first shows up in the universe, when you have a single-celled organism, because it's integral to the adaptation and survival of all life forms in changing environments. They must be able to adapt to their environment, or they don't survive, they don't reproduce, and then their line is gone. So when we look at what molecular biologists are saying, they're increasingly reading terms like prokaryotic intelligence. For those who don't know that term, prokaryotic refers to a very basic cell type. There's two types of cells, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. We're eukaryotic. We have a nucleus and a centriole, microtubules, a cytoskeleton, all that fun stuff. Prokaryotes are basically the most simple cells that we recognize and we think represent the earliest forms of life on Earth. But they talk about cells having cognitive resources or bioinformation intelligence or cellular intelligence or cellular knowledge. And just as an example, E. coli, by far the most well-studied microorganism on Earth. Researchers at Princeton recently showed that E. coli can demonstrate intelligence, that it can process a signal from its environment. In this case, these things can make you sick. But they know when they get into your mouth, the temperature goes up, and then that signals a whole metabolic pathway that says the oxygen levels are about to drop. You're not going to be able to generate your energy through oxidative respiration. You need to fall up on your backup systems. So before it arrives in your stomach, it's already predicted that it's now in your mouth, it's heading down your digestive tract. It's about to enter into an environment where the oxygen levels are not what it's used to, and it's going to need to respond to that accordingly. And it does that through its metabolic chemical pathways by generating new proteins that are capable of processing the energy in a much lower oxygen environment. Just a quick plug, we'll be talking about how we get to this level of assembly at the Origin of Life plenary on Thursday afternoon. So I'm starting out with a cell already in this presentation. Of course, when we're interested in Origin of Life, the whole trick is to figure out how you get one of these things where before there wasn't any such thing. But when we talk about intelligence in life, we really start to think about the neurons and the beginning of neural systems, because you get chemical signaling between cells. So as you start to see organisms evolving from that transition to a single-celled state to a multicellular state, they're starting to communicate with each other. So they can do this through hormones, they can do it through neurotransmitters, they can do it through pheromones, other changes in the environment that signal from one cell to another that something is happening. In the case of neurons, you got a chemical synapse where electrical activity is converted because there's a voltage-gated ion channel, calcium, to release a neurotransmitter, which is a simple molecule that jumps from one cell to the other and then sends the signal down the line. The neurotransmitters bind to receptors in the plasma membrane so that they can transmit information. And so chemical signaling together with electrical excitability are central to how these nervous systems work. So you're starting to get to that definition of intelligence beyond a cellular level, because you're starting to be able to share information. They're able to process information as a collective whole. Just to take a closer look at the neurons, these are electrically excitable cells that they communicate with each other through chemical signaling. They specialize in sending electrical signals in a preferred direction and releasing these neurotransmitters or extracellular messengers to each other. They have this branching shape featuring fine projections called axons that bring one cell into chemical contact with other cells, dendrites. And it's the main component of nervous tissue in all animals, except for two, and I'll just touch on those in the presentation because they're kind of fun, the sponges and the placozoa. And it's important to note that in the multicellular organism realm, only animals have neurons. Plants and fungi do not have neurons. They do have microtubules. And Stuart and I have talked about that. And I think Stuart was just over at the plants and consciousness session. So there might be some cool insight coming out of there. And of course, everybody that's been following the field, and especially the pioneering work of Stuart and Roger Penrose, know the microtubules are a candidate for the location of consciousness. This is just a simple diagram of the role of the microtubules falling along the axon. We heard from Travis Craddock this morning how they do all kinds of things, such as structural support, transmitting or providing pathways for these proteins to walk along, carrying the vacuoles with all kinds of important cellular components, and then possibly also entering quantum superposition states, coordinating the orchestrated objective reduction leading to consciousness. And one of the discussions we've had back and forth with Bill and Stuart is, are we talking about the same thing with embedded intelligence and consciousness, or are they different things? In the astrobiology community, interestingly, consciousness is not even really talked about at all. In fact, the fact that I'm bringing it into that community, people are looking askance at me a little suspiciously, but they're happy to talk about intelligence. Because it's measurable, it's observable, and they all think they have it. Of course, things get really interesting when you're trying to respond to your environment, when you start to connect the neurons to the muscle cells. And when you look at the history of life on Earth, these two seem to have evolved along very similar timelines and are connected intimately with each other, because the muscles are how the organism can respond to the environment. They can either run away, they can fight, they can eat, they can curl up, they can do what they need to do. So muscles are composed of tubular cells. These form muscle fibers, and these contain many chains. The motor neurons receive signals that control these muscles, and it enables coordinated contraction and relaxation of massive sheets of cells together. So now you have an intelligent system that has a way to create action in response to the information that it's processing. And this gets us to where we start to consider the mind-body problem, right? So now you've got an organism. It's capable of receiving information. It's capable of sharing information. It's capable of processing that information, and it's capable of acting upon the external environment, not just chemically, like a lot of these other organisms can do, but with action, with motion, with movement, with force, by changing the environment, moving the environment, or moving out of the environment in the case that it's unable to change it to maintain its security. So when we think about that, we get into this concept of subjectivity. This is where you get the unitary whole. These cells come together, whereas before and through most of Earth history, they were single-celled organisms. They didn't really cooperate, especially in an intelligence way. Now you've got multiple cells joining together, sharing information, and then acting in a coordinated fashion, creating a new unitary whole, which can in and of itself demonstrate intelligence and start to create an information blanket separating it from the external environment. And then it gains agency. So it can try, it can initiate, it's a source of action, and it can observe the effects of its action. And so this is how the modern neural system, the nervous system, and the muscular system started to evolve. You started to see the effect of the information, the response that your processing system generated, and did it achieve the desired result? And if it didn't, they would learn from that mistake. They would repeat the approach, change something until they found success and continue to go. So ultimately, this led to the coordinated action of millions of cells, trillions of cells, which make up the human body. New kinds of sensing arose. So in the beginning, it was mostly chemical sensing and then photon sensing. But now we can sense magnetic fields, we can sense pressure, we can sense temperature, we can sense all kinds of different aspects of our environment. And this was made possible by muscles, by our nervous system, and by specialization of neurons into different kinds of sensors. So as a result, animals respond to their environment in a realm outside of their self, and this gives the concept of a unitary whole, an internal environment, an internal system where consciousness resides, and that is separate from the external environment and separate from other organisms, separate from other unitary wholes, and separate from other consciousnesses. If we take a look at a very simple tree of life here, just focusing on the animals, there's lots of fun problems in the origin of nervous systems. The current thinking is that, so we're going back in time over 500 million years here to the Cambrian explosion, and there was an animal that gained a nervous system. And basically what I just said, it had a neuron which was capable of developing neurotransmitters, sending those to another cell that could receive them and then act upon them. And then it had connections to the muscles so that it could move, it could respond. And it looks like that goes all the way back to the last animal common ancestor. These are all the major different divisions of animal kingdom. And it looks like that the Tenefores, we'll take a look at what those are, still have a nervous system, but two groups of animals actually lost them evolutionarily. The sponges and the Placozoans have no neurons, even though they're firmly in the animal kingdom. So that's an interesting concept. Why would you lose a neural system if you had seemed like an enormous evolutionary advantage to gain a system that allows you to do these things, but these animals have gotten rid of it? Either that or there was two separate origins of neural systems in life. But the current literature is suggesting there was a single origin of a nervous system. And then as the animals evolved and separated, these two species lost them. So the most primitive form of animal that has a nervous system are the Tenefores, also known as comb jellies. These are not jellyfish. We'll talk about those next. They're similar, but separate line. These are gelatinous animals. They drift in ocean columns throughout the world. They can be as small as a few millimeters in size, up to 1.5 meters. Their body is lined with bands of hair-like cilia. So these are eukaryotes, so they will have neurons, they will have microtubules. They have coordinated motion. They use muscles for steering. And all 150 known species are carnivorous, so they eat other animals. The Placozoans, which seem like they branched off after the Tenefores, are the most simple multicellular animals that we know of. And they're actually really poorly studied. It's interesting when you try to read the literature. There's only 2 known species of these, and they're in laboratories. And in fact, 1 line has been lost. So there's only 1 under active investigation now. My sense is people just haven't gone out and looked for them to study them. They're large, flat, amoeba-like creatures up to 2 millimeters in diameter. They have the smallest amount of DNA for any known type of animal. They're made up of a few thousand cells with only 4 different types of cells. They have cover cells, they have fiber cells, they have gland cells, and they have cylinder cells. There's no internal organization. They have no tissues, they have no organs, and they move by gliding on their cilia and changing their shape like an amoeba would, although an amoeba is a single-celled organism, and these are multicellular. So these are the most primitive animals, and they have no neurons, and we're not even sure how or why how they process information, how they respond to their environment. They must, but they don't do it through neural systems like most of the other animals do. The other group of multicellular animals that don't have a neural system are the sponges. They are pretty fixed in space. They sit at the bottom of the ocean. They're filter feeders. They do have some signs of intelligence, but mostly these were the first animals that started to build up hard structural parts, which things that went on to become bones. They have internal skeletons of calcium carbonate. Some of them use silicon dioxide, which is like quartz or glass, and are called glass sponges. And here's a cool video that some ocean explorers at NOAA found a whole forest of the weird, just to give you a sense of what early life in the oceans probably looked like.
Jeez.
Yeah, you're
Talk
right.
about a Dr. Seuss
Yeah.
like landscape. Wow.
Look at this. This is amazing.
That
If we could just hold the scene for a moment.
Wow.
This is Attack of the Sponges here.
You wanted sponges, Chris.
Yeah, I got them. Yeah, that's well, okay. I got them. Wow.
The great thing about this that I love is the way they're all oriented directly into the current. This one looks like a Muppet.
This is why sometimes I think these sponges, when you come up against something like this, you think you're on a different planet. Just so strange.
Wow. It goes on and on too.
Every time we do these dives, all I can think about is, you know, this is the type of experience someone would have if they found like life on another planet. You know, everything's so alien to, at least for me, even though I've been doing it for 5 years, it's still like I'm on another planet and we're down here.
Yeah, and it's definitely the same for me as well, pilot, because even though I work on these sponges, a scene like this is just extraordinary.
And I'll toss my hat in the ring too, as a person who studies echinoderms, which are even more bizarre. These things just stun me. Like a forest of the weird.
So it would be a good question to ask, is an animal like that intelligent? And it would seem so. They lack neurons or any kind of nervous tissue, but they can perform movements that are coordinated over their whole body. They squeeze their water channels and expel excess sediment. They can contract if there's a predator coming and reduce the area that's vulnerable. And if two sponges fuse together, the contraction waves become coordinated, and they may involve chemicals similar to neurotransmitters, so they can join up and start to talk to each other through chemistry. And they can transmit electrical impulses, the glass sponges, to their flagella if the incoming water is toxic or has excessive sediment. They'll stop ingesting the food, wait for the water to clear, and then start to eat again. So they have some form of intelligence even without a neural system. And when we start to get to our closer ancestors, we get to the Cnidarians. These are the jellyfish that people are thinking about. Also quite alien looking, I think. They have similar structures to the Tenefores, the comb jellies. They have external epidermis, internal gastrodermis, and gelatinous mesoglia in between. They have fringes of tentacles equipped with cnidocytes around their edges, and they're specialized for capturing prey. These are like the stingers that are characteristic of jellyfish. So they're triggered by motion or by chemistry, and they'll inject a poison, which they're also all predators. So if we take a look at the brains, they don't have brains like we typically think of them. They have a network of neurons, or a neural net, that allows them to sense their environment, such as changes in the water chemistry, food being nearby, touching another animal. It has some specialized structures for balancing and light sensing, and they respond to visual stimuli, even though they don't know how they do it because they don't have a brain. But somehow they're processing light, they're generating in some sort of internal image, and then maneuvering around their environment as a result of that. They have a nerve ring shaped around as we'll see. Let's take a look here, actually. This is a shot of their nervous system. So this is a view using different staining techniques to show the different kinds of cells. They have local concentration of neurons around their mouth opening. They have two types of nerve cells, the sensory and the ganglion neurons, and muscular fibers detected in red here. So this is as basic as it gets for an animal's neural system. You've got the neurons and you've got the muscles, and that's about it. Some of them have started to develop sensory organs, like those light sensing
although that's most like a recent evolutionary development and not something that existed way back in the Cambrian. And yeah, so if we take a look at what we think of as modern neural systems, like in the animals, you got to get to the bilaterans. These are all the animals that have bilateral symmetry like humans do. So we walked through kind of this whole group down here, the sponges, the Tenefores, the Cnidarians, and the Placozoans. And then everybody else in the animal kingdom has bilateral symmetry, from the worms up to the humans. And we can go back to what we think the last common ancestor looked like. What did it have to have? This is where you start to see cephalization. That is the generation of a head with a large amount of sensory organs centered around it, like your eyes. You have a central nervous system. You start to see a cardio system and a digestive system, and segmentation, like as characteristic of the arthropods, the things like lobsters or insects. And only 3 of these groups have actually developed large nervous systems with complex behaviors. The arthropods, which I said are like the lobsters, the shrimp, and also the insects, the cephalopods, like the octopus, and the vertebrates, like us. So if we're thinking about embedded intelligence, here's a little cartoon from Scientific American, where you start out way back in the Precambrian, and you go through the single-celled organisms, you create the eukaryotic cells, and then you start to get the sponges and the jellies, and then you get this bilateral symmetry, which was probably this little worm, and then you start to develop animals like the arthropods that live on the ocean floor, and then you get to the animals coming onto the land, and then to the mammals, and then to the humans. So it's kind of fun to look at what these different animals, so arthropods, cephalopods, and vertebrates, the only animals that have complex nervous systems. And they're very different the way they're laid out. This is an example of an arthropod nervous system. This is a grasshopper. Its brain is divided into distinct areas. So it has the protocerebrum here, which controls its vision. It has a separate brain structure for interpreting signals from its antenna. It has a whole set of nerves that control its mouth and its salivary glands. And then it has a whole distributed set of these ganglia that run all the way down its digestive system to regulate its digestive. And then finally, its sensory organs and its heart muscles here. Cephalopods also have a very complex nervous system, very different than what we have in humans. They often said to have 9 brains. Each of the 8 arms of the octopus has its own separate little brain, and then there's a much larger brain centered around its mouth. And if you watch their behavior, the arms will often behave independently of each other, like they're a separate mind, but they may all come together as a single mind. So this is used often to discuss the phenomena of like split brain patients that have had severe epilepsy, where the 2 halves of their brain have been divided, and they often report 2 personalities or 2 consciousnesses. There's thoughts that maybe something like the cephalopod could have as many as 9 consciousnesses, and then they all come together as a single one when they need to respond to their environment, say, to move away from a predator. And then if we look at the vertebrates, you can see the evolution of the brain and probably the mind here, starting with the very simple brain of the shark. They all have the same number of brain segments and brain structures, but some of them are obviously much bigger than others. So the shark has the largest part of its brain is its olfactory lobe. It's primarily dealing with smell, sensing, and prey. And it doesn't have a lot going on in its cortex. And then you can see as you as you move through the evolutionary sequence from amphibians to frogs to reptiles to dinosaurs to humans or mammals, you can see that the brain has maintained all of the different parts. It's just that the sizes of them relative to one another has increased. So if we're starting to think about embedded intelligence, I would want to see us try to quantify it as a function of these different brain structures. I would say the same thing to Stuart and Roger. It kind of came up in this morning's plenary. We heard about objective reduction, but if I understand the theory, it's the orchestration of the objective reduction that's really key. And I would say this set of neural systems might give you a way to understand the different orchestrations that might take place. Something simple like a Cnidarian neural net, up to a grasshopper that's very much interested in its antenna and its mouth, right? To the octopus, where each arm is controlled by a separate brain, all the way to the mammals, like the horse or the humans here, which have the very large prefrontal cortex. And then it gets into what Stuart was just talking about in terms of expanding our intelligence now. So I would say in this presentation, as an astrobiologist, we're saying intelligence at best starts at the cellular level. And then it's when you develop that neuron and the neurotransmitter and the signaling and multicellularity that intelligence really starts to grow in its capability, its capacity. And then you get the animal brains with the neurons and ultimately the specialization to the humans. And then we start to apply our intelligence outside of our bodies. And we call that technology, right? It's the application of our knowledge, our tools, our skills to solve problems and extend our capabilities. It's the generation of knowledge to develop systems that solve problems. And this is a definition I came up with. We'll hear from Sarah Walker on Thursday in the Origin of Life plenary session about her definition of life as it relates to information theory. I take that and I say technology is when life extends information to take control of matter beyond that in which it's instantiated. So now we're using our information to design all of these crazy and amazing devices that we have here. And we've done that really starting since 1950. We've had this explosive growth in technology continuing today, where we are pretty much fully invested in gathering, processing, storing, and distributing information, right? That's what we do as a species. Some of it seems useless, some of it seems really important, but it doesn't seem to matter. We dump it on the internet, we share it with each other, we talk about it. And so information is what we do. And intelligence is all about using that information to solve problems and respond to your environment. So I like this little summary chart here, kind of talks about the evolution of intelligence. And so for Bill and for Stuart to think about, where does consciousness come up in this system? Where does intelligence and are the same thing? When the reason I'm here is because I've read Stuart's papers about the quantum origin of life and have some inkling that consciousness might start way up here with these aromatic molecules that might be the beginning of it, or proto-consciousness. But is that also intelligence? Do you need to have intelligence to be conscious, or can you just simply be? And then you get to the information-bearing molecules. We think RNA is the most likely original nucleic acid. And then as the system evolved, you got to DNA. You develop eukaryotes with the specialized cell structures and the cytoskeleton. And then you got to multicellularity, leading through that evolutionary sequence that I've just breezed through to advanced brains, to producing digital realm that we're in today, and then into the future, the bio-digital fusion. So part of our conversation could be, where in this sequence does intelligence arise? The astrobiology community would struggle even to say that the cellular level is intelligence and that you'd need to get to the brain level. Where does consciousness arise? As far as I understand, the neuroscience community, they would say the same thing. You don't get consciousness until the brain arises. And so we want to be able to go back through time here and say, where do these phenomena arise? And what does that tell us about the origin of life? The other area where intelligence comes up in astrobiology is in searching for it, extraterrestrial intelligence. So I'm going to give a little bit of a whirlwind history of that. What do we mean by searching for extraterrestrial intelligence and extraterrestrial consciousness? And that's why we named our session Astro Consciousness, because Stuart and I are trying to bring that concept forward, that maybe you're looking for intelligence, but you're really looking for consciousness, I think. So how do we do this now? It's very much capability and technology driven. And it goes all the way back, as we'll see, into the 1950s. But it's looking for somebody that's interested in talking to us. And that has developed technology. So you're not really looking for intelligence. You're looking for extraterrestrial technology right now. How we might be able to search for intelligence is an interesting and different conversation. And when we look at ways that we could be communicating across interstellar distances, we're thinking light waves, radio waves. And this graph over here shows you the background noise of the universe as a function of frequency. So you have these really low frequency, long radio waves, a lot of noise, cosmic microwave background radiation, and then you reach a minimum here, and then you start to get into all kinds of high frequency, high energy starlight and X-rays and things like that. So you got this little lull down here, kind of the radio quiet realm of the universe. We call it the water hole because there's two spectral lines, hydrogen being the most abundant chemical element in the universe, and oxygen being the third most abundant chemical element in the universe. The H and the OH molecules have radio emission lines right there. So we also think any intelligent civilization would know about those, and that we use this little water hole to search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and as we'll see, even to try to message them. But really, we look over this whole frequency range here. This goes back to Frank Drake, 1960. He was at the Green Bank Observatory, and he decided to point his radio telescope at two nearby stars, Tau Ceti and Epsilon Eridani. For 200 hours, didn't hear or see anything, but that got the community really excited, and the field of SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, was born. And we have this innate desire to communicate about ourselves, to tell the universe that we're out there. That's part of our intelligence, I think, is to do that. And so when we send these spacecraft out into deep space, especially when we send them off into interplanetary space, or interstellar space, leaving the solar system like the Pioneer missions do, we leave these little symbols behind. So this is a plaque that's on the two Pioneer spacecraft, which were the first two spacecraft to leave the solar system. There's some basic information like the structure of our solar system down here, the trajectory of the spacecraft. So it left the third planet, flew by the fifth planet, which is Jupiter, used Jupiter's gravity to fling it out of the solar system. This is a little map in case the aliens find it. This tells us, based on a series of pulsars, where they can come find the Earth. Here's the hydrogen atom, which we think they'd be very familiar with. And then here's two phenotypes of human beings, so they know what we look like should they come across us here. You might have heard of the WOW signal. It's almost an urban myth at this point. In 1973, they were using a radio telescope at Ohio State University. They picked up a signal from Sagittarius. This is what their data used to look like as it got printed out on their dot matrix printer. There was a really large radio burst here, one time only. They wrote WOW in the margin, but it's never been heard from again. So that could have just been some fluke. When the Arecibo radio telescope, which was in Puerto Rico, first came online, they broadcast a message like this. Very complicated system, but it's 1,679 bits, which are two prime numbers, 73 by 23 multiplied by each other. We sent this to a globular cluster, 25,000 light years from Earth. So it left in 1974, if you want to set your calendar or when it's going to get there. It's meant as a demonstration of our human achievement, but we're giving them the natural numbers, the atomic numbers of hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus, which make up our DNA. The number of nucleotides in our genome, and graphic of the solar system. And this is the radio dish down here, how we actually transmitted the message. Similarly, on Voyager, we put the golden record on. Not only did we etch the same kind of symbols that we put on the Pioneer plaques, but this is actually a phonograph, and it includes instructions on how to build a record player. So if you find it, you can presumably build this machine, put the record on there, and it contains all the songs and sounds of Earth. Carl Sagan and the Planetary Society coordinated all of that. And then they really started to try to make a science out of it with the mega channel extraterrestrial array. It was funded by Steven Spielberg, came online in 1985. It operated for 10 years, found 37 candidate events, but nothing has ever been repeated there as well. So there's tantalizing hints. NASA got involved in the late 1970s. There was two approaches. They were going to do a targeted survey at a series of stars, nearby sun-like stars, as well as a whole sky survey. And the program went online in 1992. It had a lot of political challenges. So they, instead of calling it SETI, they rebranded it as the High Resolution Microwave Survey. But it was attacked in 1993 by the senator from Nevada, Richard Bryan, who said, hopefully this will be the end of Martian hunting season at the taxpayers' expense. And that was the end of NASA's funded SETI. Ironically, also the year we returned to Mars with the Mars Observer spacecraft. So apparently it was okay to go hunt Martians at Mars, just not in interstellar space. But Jill Tarter, you may know her as the Jodie Foster character from the movie Contact, really worked hard to pull all of this together, got private funding, and from 1995 through 2004 ran the Project Phoenix, which scanned sun-like stars in that gigahertz frequency near that water. So they were able to do the targeted search using private money, but the all-sky search was canceled. And even to this day, SETI is a four-letter word you cannot say at NASA headquarters. So it is still really taboo to talk about SETI, definitely to talk about consciousness. Fortunately, astrobiology has been able to come along, and studying life in the universe is now okay. Just some of the things that came out of SETI, you might have remembered the SETI at home screensaver. So they were trying to process all of that data from all of those radio telescopes that Jill Tarter was funding. They released the SETI at home project, and that ran for over 20 years, and 5.2 million people participated. No signals were repeated in that either. And then Paul Allen came along in 2007, funded the Allen Telescope Array, using digital technology built for long-term scalability. And right now they have 42 dishes. They were going to go for 350, but they ran out of money. And 42 is, of course, the answer to life, the universe, and everything, which is why they picked that. And then a couple other things that have happened along these lines. So there was in 2017, this interstellar object entered the solar system. It was named Oumuamua. It was after a Hawaiian word for traveler. It cruised in, zipped around the sun, and headed back into outer space. This is an artist's conception of what it might have looked like. It looks like a cigar, a space cigar. It is a very strange shaped object. We know that shape from what we call a light curve. So we watch it as it through our telescopes as it's moving through the solar system, and you can see it get brighter and dimmer and brighter and dimmer. It's rotating right about this axis. So sometimes you see this really long surface, and then sometimes you just see the small surface that's pointed towards you. Harvard professor Avi Loeb, who is our keynote speaker on Thursday afternoon in the Astro Consciousness plenary session, proposed that it could be an alien probe. And you'll hear from him. I won't go into the story there. You'll hear from him what happened in the community after he suggested that. And the reason he said that is because, if it was a comet, it would have started outgassing on its way in as it approached the sun and got close to the sun. And definitely at its perihelion, when it was closest to the sun, you would have seen some outgassing and some acceleration, but we didn't see that. But as it left the solar system, it accelerated on its way out. And that's why Avi said, maybe this was an alien probe. He's not saying it is an alien probe. He's just saying maybe it is. And even that is not allowed in the community. You're not even allowed to put that hypothesis forward. There might be another explanation for it, but I'm just saying you should put it on the table. So we'll hear from Avi all about that on Thursday. And then there was Tabby Star. So there was the Kepler Space Telescope, which was built to search for extrasolar planets. It does this by measuring the light curve. So it's looking at the star and it's measuring how bright it is and how dim it is over time. And if a planet goes in front of a star, its signal drops because the planet's blocking some of the sunlight. So it gets a little dimmer, and then the planet gets out of the way, and then the star goes back to its brightness. Well, there was this star nicknamed Tabby Star after the postdoc who discovered it using the help of citizen scientists. And it went through really unusual dimming patterns. It dropped about 22% of its brightness, and it wasn't a repeatable pattern like a planet is, right? A planet's going around in a regular orbit. You can predict it. It comes back, the star dims, goes away, and you know what's going to be there. This is a very irregular cycle of brightening and dimming of the star. And it's unlike any other thing in the Kepler field of view. Nothing else is showing this kind of behavior. None of them explain this light curve. People have said maybe it's a swarm of comets, maybe it's a vast dust cloud. The infrared data don't support that. And so the third one that's out there is an alien megastructure, kind of like a Dyson sphere where they're trying to surround the star with alien technology. Not saying that that is what it is, but I'm saying it should be at least considered if we believe intelligence is present in the universe and consciousness is present in the universe. And then you get to the Breakthrough Listen project. This is the one that's going on right now. This is funded by Yuri Milner, who's a billionaire interested in searching for extraterrestrial intelligence, also designing a probe to go to probe Alpha Centauri, the nearest star system to the Earth. And they're searching for signs of intelligent life at radio, the water band, but also looking in optical wavelengths. And they've been doing this since 2016. They did have a really interesting signal. They published it in Nature just last year. They haven't fully ruled out what it is. They say it's most likely an unusual but locally generated form of interference, but analysis is ongoing. So people are still trying to search for extraterrestrial intelligence out there. And then the final question I'll leave us with and get us back to embedded intelligence is, should we be messaging extraterrestrial intelligences? You've probably all heard of Fermi's paradox, right? This is, it is true for if we're studying consciousness in the universe. Why isn't it everywhere? Why isn't Mars covered in conscious beings and Venus covered in conscious beings and the moons of Jupiter and Saturn? Why is it only in our solar system and the Earth as far as we know, and nowhere else do we have definitive proof of it right now? This is known as Fermi's paradox. Fermi said there's a galaxy with so much potential for life, for intelligence, for consciousness, it should be full of extraterrestrial beings. Most stars in our galaxy are older than the sun, and so they should be millions of years ahead of us from an evolutionary perspective, although what triggers those different stages of evolution, we're not sure. Come to my talk on Thursday for one idea. And Fermi calculated that even if species are moving between stars at less than the speed of light, they should have colonized the galaxy by now, and we should see evidence of it. So where is everybody? So the question is, should we be the ones that are reaching out? Maybe everybody's keeping their mouth shut, right? And so this is a fun debate to have. I do this with my students in the classroom. Like, everybody's afraid that these might be hostile aliens, and if we let them know we're here, maybe they're going to come and try to conquer us. But as you look at what we're doing, searching for extrasolar planets, searching for life on other planets, the Earth is going to stand out as something really different from the rest of the planets, at least the ones that we've discovered so far in our area of the galaxy. First of all, we've got this really unusual oxygen-rich atmosphere, and we've had that for 2 billion years, right? Oxygen is produced biologically. It's out of equilibrium with the surface of the planet and the other gases in the atmosphere. If there wasn't an active source of oxygen, which is photosynthesis, there wouldn't be all this oxygen built up in our atmosphere. And more recently, once humans got involved and started applying our intelligence to our technology, we're creating all kinds of chemicals that we're putting in the atmosphere that have really whopping strong spectral signals that you would never expect to form through a geologic process. For example, chlorofluorocarbons, which we use as refrigerants. And then we also send out a lot of radio signals. People like to talk about radio broadcasts, TV broadcasts. Those are actually going away after a pretty short time. But in my business, we use radio telescopes for probing asteroids and other planets. And we send really powerful radio beams out to bounce off of these objects. And they'll travel all the way across the galaxy. For example, in 2018, we did a study that said if you beam a 1 to 2 megawatt infrared laser through a 30 to 45 meter telescope, it could be picked up 20,000 light years from now. So one possible solution to the Fermi paradox is that maybe extraterrestrial civilizations have been too scared when their leaders have said, don't send out any signals. And that we might be the one to break the great silence. The great silence, breaking the great silence, or the war on great silence must begin at home. So then the question is, what do we do if we find a signal from an intelligence? So far, there's no convincing evidence for biology beyond our home planet. But let's say next week we detect a ping from the cosmos and it's repeatable and we can verify that it's there. Then what do we do? There's actually no plan. If you were hopeful that we had our act together, you're wrong. There was a subcommittee of the International Academy of Astronautics called Declaration of Principles Concerning the Conduct of the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. So if we get a compelling signal, verify that it's extraterrestrial, announce it to the world, and do not reply. This is near and dear to my heart. I started my career in SETI way back as an undergraduate here at the University of Arizona back in 1992, and I worked for Professor Carl DeVito, and this would be interesting from an embedded intelligence perspective. Let's say we actually break the silence. We get that signal, we overrule the IAA, and we say, we're going to communicate, and we start a dialogue. How do you even talk to an alien intelligence, right? So you have to assume some things. You got to assume that they know math. And maybe that's fundamental to embedded intelligence, that they can count and they can do arithmetic. It doesn't have to be fancy Hamiltonian solutions to the quantum wave function. It can simply be the integers and the basic functions of your calculator. They must know about chemical elements in the periodic table. And sorry, Bill, we're not going to add any new stable elements anytime soon because they're all stable. And if they were stable, they'd be naturally occurring. But they must have made a quantitative study about the states of matter, and they must know enough chemistry to carry out chemical calculations. And if they could do all of this stuff we knew how to do in the 19th century, DeVito says we can communicate basic ideas like the gram, the calorie, the degree, our units of pressure. And once we start building our fundamental physical constants, we can talk about anything in the physical universe, including our biology. And then the final question is, what should we leave behind? So what is the lifetime of an advanced communicating civilization like us? We heard some questions for Bill about the habitability of the Earth, and are we changing the habitability so that humans are not going to be able to survive here? Lower bound, we've had radio technology for about 100 years, and maybe we're at the end of our rope here. How long will it last? Are we going to make it 10,000 years, a million years? When the sun runs out of its core hydrogen 5 billion years from now? Some people argue that we should leave a record behind. If we are an intelligence, it's even if there is embedded intelligence in every atom of the universe, what we have is something very different than that. Way more advanced, way more coordinated. And so we should leave a record of our existence, even if human civilization is going to end. Something like the alien megastructure that you could even encode information that would be stable, orbitally stable for billions of years, like the planets and the satellites are today. So that's a whirlwind of intelligence seen through the eyes of an astrobiologist. I think Stuart is up next. He's, I think, going to follow on with some similar thoughts from consciousness and spirituality. So Stuart, I'll take any questions on that, and then we'll invite Stuart up. Thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah, I have a question on brain hemisphericity. I have never been able to find where that evolutionary phenomena occurred and at what level of animal development.
I would say let's see, the brain hemisphericity, it would have to be in the bilaterans. We don't see it in the octopus. So probably the fish. I think it's the fish be the first ones that had that. Any other questions? Yes, Travis.
Thanks. That was a great talk. When we're beaming signals out there to whatever's out there, how long do they send signals for? Is it like a pulse? Is it for years? Is it?
Definitely, it's a short burst, like within a day or two, maybe a week of transmitting. So
And
there's
then never
nobody.
again?
Yeah, there's a lot of groups out there that are generating their own messages and then renting time on a radio telescope and broadcasting them into space. But it's a fundraising, as you can imagine, a private endeavor.
So these things like the WOW event,
Mhm.
could that not be some other advanced civilization being like, oh, well, let's fire off this way?
That's right.
Chances of us finding someone are kind of pointless.
Yeah,
but-
there is no systematic attempt to transmit information to nearby star systems on a regular basis. So yeah, we would be a WOW event in most cases, even when we use Arecibo or the Goldstone radio telescopes to bounce off an asteroid. It's very much where is that object in its orbit relative to the Earth, and we shoot in that direction. So it's pretty random because we're moving around the sun, we're rotating, revolving, and the asteroid is on its own separate orbit. So there is I don't think an alien civilization has a chance of getting a repeat signal off of us on any of these targeted transmissions.
So we're safe then, is what you're saying.
I'm not going to promise that.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
How important do you think consciousness is in the evolution of all this intelligence?
I think it's very important, which is why I'm here, to learn more about it and to see how it fits into that whole scheme. But I think a rarity in the community, evolutionary biology, astrobiology, neuroscience, it's not talked about at all. And so that's when I found Stuart's papers on the quantum origin of life and the role of consciousness, even the idea that consciousness might precede life. I thought this needs to be investigated. And we found some interesting stuff. I think it's worth pursuing, but it would be a huge scientific revolution, to go back to what Bill was discussing earlier, in the field. It is not even acknowledged as a phenomena in evolution that consciousness even matters. From my reading of it, the most pessimistic assessment of the origin of consciousness is it didn't arise until humans developed language about 50,000 years ago. There was no consciousness in the entire history of the Earth until 50,000 years ago. That's the end member. All the way to, I would say, what Stuart's proposing is that consciousness is arising through these superposition states and aromatic molecules before life even exists, right? So you've got a pretty wide spectrum of ideas right now, all the way from before life to modern humans, basically, where consciousness enters the universe. I'm more inclined to go with Stuart's ideas, but I think it needs to be investigated. That's why I'm here. Yeah.
It was a really beautiful talk. I truly enjoyed it. So sort of speaking out of my heart, or your perspective. But I have one issue that I think is important to talk about, and that's the way we discuss technology. And in my opinion, technology is way too focused on what I would call physical technology. It is technology. It means our ability to transform matter and energy, whereas what Eric Beinhoger and others are calling social technology, which is our ability to organize ourselves in terms of collaboration and communication and whatnot. Because without communication and coordination, we couldn't make any of this technology we do today.
Mm-hmm.
And as some of the young people who were up here earlier saying, how are we going to address our issues with climate change and loss of biodiversity? It's not being done by making new devices. It is done by fixing some of the obvious problems we have with our social technologies, how we actually organize each other and the economic system and our institutions and yada yada.
Right.
And I just want to emphasize
like
that technology is, from my perspective, is something we should think about in a broader sense, because else we just lose the big picture.
It's very much like the development of the neuron, the ability to communicate and start to
that's sort of
cooperate.
at a micro level,
Right.
But we couldn't, even if we have had many gazillions of neurons, we couldn't do anything unless we cooperated. We had these organizations, this other technology around us.
I like it. A lot of these charts are from my astrobiology class that I taught last semester, and one of the things I love to do with the students is work on definitions of these terms, right? Because life, information, consciousness, technology, these are tricky, right, to get a good definition. So we'll chat later to work that into the next round of teaching it again in the fall.
Thank you, Dante, for the very stimulating presentation. I'm curious, in the typical origin of life model and the development of the protocell, okay, where you have some emergence of an RNA within a lipoid, bubble per se. I'm wondering if the development of sciences to study the nervous system has potentially skipped a step, whereas you have that bubble, that membrane. And so from your perspective, what studies have been done to look at an intelligent membrane and organizing the sense of consciousness and that here on the planet and all the species, as part of that is an intelligent membrane, and inside that you have the highly sophisticated nervous system. I'm just curious, is that an area of exploration? Is that an opportunity?
Yeah, there's it comes to mind a writer, Franklin Harold, has written a couple of really good books on it. Franklin Harold, The Way of the Cell and In Search of Cell History, where he takes it, and that's where I started to come up with that concept of the unitary whole. So there's a lot more information in the cell than just in the nucleic acid sequence, right? That whole cellular membrane, it's very structured. It contains a lot of information. And so I think there are people who are thinking about that, but when you read his writings, he's very much swimming against the tide, right? Against the current as well. It's like, and I'm not a biologist, right? Even though I claim to be an astrobiologist, there's a lot of people who claim to be astrobiologists. Biology, I'm coming up to speed on as I go. But most biology, 99% of it is about grinding up the cell into the molecular components and understanding that molecular inventory. Yeah. And the sense is, if we could just figure out all of the molecules that are present in the cell, we will understand how a cell works. And Franklin would say, no, you need to understand that whole organizational structure, because there's a lot of information encoded in there, and you need a cell to make a cell. We have no evidence on Earth of a cell arising abiotically, right? Every cell on this planet today came from a precursor cell, right? So the trick is to make that first cell, and you've got to have the membrane, you've got to have the nucleic acid, you got to have all the proteins, and you got to have the structure, the organization of all of those components so they interoperate.
Yeah, it's the systems biology for the precision. I think that's a flaw within our 900-year evolution of scientific method, is that potentially the scientific method has evolved regarding the pendulation between an kind of vasopressin kind of scientific cut and separate versus more of a molecular oxytocin whole system, love and trust, systems biology.
That's right.
I think that's a 900-year mammalian evolution that we'd look at. Could I ask the last name of Franklin?
Sure. I would just add to my answer. I think it's also endemic in the origin of life community, right? The origin of life community is very much focused on those nucleic acids. If we could just get a phosphorylated nucleic acid, we would solve the origin of life. But we can't even do that right now.
Yeah,
right?
I think in part it's also a focus on having a structure of at least Western culture of orienting measurement from the head itself. Right. Where if you go back, if you step back in brain development into the hippocampus, maybe the brainstem and such like that, prior to the central nervous system in the development of the fetus, you have a membrane. And then you have the neurons developing. And so are we missing this opportunity of skin and touch and presence and some type of potential, biofield intelligence, and how potentially is that evolving as a communication structure?
Right. Good point.
Looking
Jeff, you have
forward to
another question?
Thursday.
Did you have one more? No? Yeah. Yep, Thursday, Origin of Life plenary session. More fun to come.
Great talk, thank you. Did you say about the sponges that they didn't have a nervous system, but they had electric pulses at the sensory
That's right.
periphery?
Yeah, that's
So
right.
what
They don't
is
have it. They don't
the-
have neurons.
Okay, and so is that the definition of a nervous system? It needs to have neurons?
Yeah.
According to you, I mean.
Yes, based on the neural systems of most animals on Earth. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So plants and fungi, they've got their own thing going on. They don't have neurons. They've got intelligence, maybe. I didn't get to go to that session this afternoon, but Sir Stuart will tell me. But there's evidence that maybe plants have intelligence, fungi have intelligence. I mean, I'm even arguing bacteria have intelligence, right? So you don't need a nervous system to be able to respond intelligently to your environment.
Sure, yeah, they seem to do these things without the nervous system. So.
Right.
And what is the difference between sponges and the mycelium or fungi? Is there one obvious one, or they seem very similar to me?
Well, the cellular structure, like the fungi have a different kind of cell wall. They have a different organelle. It's got a German name I can't remember right now. So it has a different chemical for its cell wall. It has different organelles. So the sponges are truly animals, eukaryotic cells with the same cellular membrane and mitochondria, no chloroplasts and no other organelles like that are characteristic of the fungi.
Okay. And in terms of operation, they're pretty similar.
And a lot of their metabolic proteins are animal-like and not fungi-like.
Okay. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah. Right. One more? Yes. Great.
Yes, I have a question just about how important you think memory is in terms of intelligent systems, and if that's a critical component to developing
I think so, because in the definition I landed on, which was a kind of a synthesis of all those, right? You have to be able to learn from experience. So if you're learning from experience, you've got to remember something that happened in the past, which means so something happened, didn't work out the way you wanted it to, so you're going to try something different. So you've got to be able to remember in order to have that learning, I think.
So would an RNA virus, would that not fit that, definition then, or is the
viruses are really interesting when it comes to astrobiology and the definition of life, right? A lot of them, people would argue they're not alive. They are alive, I think. Whether they're intelligent, that's a good question. Do they process information? Yes, they're information-bearing molecules. Do they solve problems? Do they adapt to their environment? Yeah, I think they do all that. So they would have to be intelligent. So yeah, I think more thought about what a virus is in the definition realm of life and intelligence is warranted. A lot of people say they're not. They're latecomers evolutionarily, but they might be most primitive.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, let's go over to Stuart. I got your presentation booted up here. I think I can avoid the auto advance that Bill is having, so, oops. This is active. You want that to advance, or you just use the arrow keys. Okay.
Well, thank you, Dante, and thank you, Bill. Thank you all for being here. Before I forget, let me respond about the plants. I know from inside information, one take-home message was that plant behavior, like plants that follow the sun, phototropism, and the Venus flytrap, but particular phototropism, the movement is actually controlled by microtubules in the plants, in the roots, and it can be anesthetized. If you give the plant anesthesia, various forms, you block this. That does not necessarily mean they are conscious. You could be blocking a behavioral response. My own bias is that all organisms have some consciousness, because behavior is driven by feelings. If you in a lab looking at rats or any type of behavior, it's always reward or avoiding displeasure. So I suspect there's some rudimentary feelings going on in all organisms, and including plants. And as Dante said, I think feelings might have precipitated the origin of life and is driving its evolution. Okay, so let's turn to the topic at hand: embedded intelligence and theories of consciousness, or just of consciousness. I first, Dante told me about Bill and his embedded intelligence idea, and I met Bill and talked to him and thought there were some really interesting ideas there. If I didn't quite understand all aspects of it, and I think it's a work in progress, but it raises a lot of issues for consciousness, understanding consciousness, and therefore theories of consciousness. So Wikipedia says that embedded intelligence is the ability of a product, process, or service to monitor and reflect on its own functioning, providing feedback for enhancement of function. So here's a picture of an embedded system on a plug-in card, and I'm pretty sure, maybe Bill can correct me, that this is the embedded system. That's because the lettering's upside down compared to everything else. That's why I'm making that guess. That's plugged in so it can monitor what's going on, report to some global control system, and therefore provide feedback and error correction and monitor and optimize the system. So that's my understanding of a technological system of embedded intelligence. And what's one interesting facet is that the information is collected locally by embedded sensors and communicated globally across scales. It goes to a larger scale for integration and self-reflection. And this is the heart of the matter of the problem in consciousness studies: integration, self-reflection, and what that actually means. And so it's similar to the nervous system, brain, and consciousness. And the similarities between brain functions there are similarities between brain functions supporting consciousness and embedded intelligence. For example, integrating across scales, or orchestrating, and integrated information theory is one prominent theory put forth by Tononi and supported by Koch, Christoph. And orchestrated objective reduction is the theory that Roger Penrose and I have. And orchestration is a little bit is different from integration for reasons that I won't go into at this point. But the important point that I want to make is that it's across scales. So you start from low down, embedded, small, and go up in scale to larger systems, more global systems where the information is integrated and some action is taken to feedback and optimize the system. So it's across scales, or another way of putting that is a spatio-temporal hierarchy. And I think this is a key feature of life, and particularly consciousness in the brain, and also accessible memory. And this is relevant to the question near the end there about memory, because you could just say embedded intelligence is memory, and you access it in consciousness is a process that occurs in that accessible memory. So that brings us to the problem of consciousness. And we take it for granted. I've shown this slide many times, so many of you have seen it, I'm sure. We take it for granted that when we open our eyes, the world out there appears inside our head, being. And I use the word being to imply a subjective phenomenal experience. And it can be approached by neuroscientists to probe the brain, artificial intelligence people who build chips and machines to hopefully emulate the brain as much as possible. Artists, physicists, I should add astronomers here, since Dante has opened a new area of astronomy into looking at consciousness. Psychiatrists, anesthesiologists, the guy looks like me for some reason, meditators, and philosophers. And in Western philosophy and modern neuroscience, the basic idea is that the world out there is all in our head. It's a representation and being. And of course, that representation may not be accurate. We don't really know what's out there. I see all you guys out there and you see me, but I don't know you're really out there. I think you are. And of course, Descartes had this idea we could be all a brain in a vat and the matrix and all that. And Chalmers are going to talk about it could be a simulation and stuff like that. But I think for all practical purposes, most people would say that the world out there is represented in our head, at least in Western philosophy. In Eastern philosophy, consciousness pervades a deeper level of reality, and being is everywhere. And this is what Deepak Chopra and others would say. And I think there's some truth to both of these, because I think quantum state reductions are producing proto-conscious moments here, there, and everywhere, and they must be orchestrated or integrated in the brain to give the kind of consciousness that we have. So a brief overview of the philosophy of philosophical approaches to consciousness. Panpsychism takes the idea that mind and matter are not quite equivalent, but that mind or consciousness is a property of matter. Emergence or materialism or computationalism suggests that matter produces mind one way or the other. And I'll come back to that point. Idealism, Bishop Berkeley or Eastern philosophy, that mind creates matter, that consciousness is all there is. And this is what, again, Deepak would say. Dualism would say that mind and matter are separate. The simulation hypothesis that we'll hear about on Friday from Chalmers is that a simulator, and that could be a deity, it could be almost anything as far as I can tell, creates both matter and mind. And dual aspect monism that creates that there's something, some common entity, and this I think started with Bertrand Russell, and it gives rise to both mind and matter. And the Orco-R theory that Roger Penrose and I have says that one common thing is space-time geometry, which upon collapse of the wave function gives rise to mind and matter, a particular state of matter, and that mind is being. So this is all more or less perception. And there's something called the perception action cycle that Walter Freeman, for one, used to talk about. Walter was a great neuroscientist who came to our conference many times over the years. And as input comes into the nervous system over on this side, we can respond with some output. And the simplest is at the level of the spinal cord. It's strictly reflex and strictly algorithmic. And as we go up the nervous system into primary sensory and associative, and then eventually up to the brain, there are responses that can occur that are, the lower you are, the more algorithmic, the more reflexive and autopilot, without involving consciousness and without really involving deviation from algorithmic processing, which is, I think, an important point of consciousness, that we're not necessarily algorithmic. We have this non-computable effect that Penrose talked about. But once we get up into the subconscious, and then eventually consciousness, our actions are not necessarily algorithmic. We do things sometimes that surprise ourselves, or because of a hunch, intuition, divine guidance, the way of the Tao, whatever you want to call it, but something that's not necessarily algorithmic. There's some added feature, and what that is, it involves consciousness, and that's what we're looking for. If we're all algorithmic, things would be very boring and predictable and totally deterministic. And some people believe that that's true. I want to make the point that conscious perception involves three waves. And if you go back to the picture of Plato, whoever that was, you saw that the light of the tree goes through the eyes, and all sensory information except for smell, which comes directly into the olfactory cortex, goes to the thalamus in the middle, at the kind of the top of the spinal cord and brainstem and whatnot. And from there it goes in 3 waves before perception. In the case of vision, the information goes to the back of the brain, to V1, visual cortex 1, where consciousness does not occur as far as anybody can tell. And then in a second wave, there's a feed forward loop that goes through associative cortex. And for example, for vision, shape, color, motion, meaning of the visual object are processed and integrated or orchestrated. And then we get to the front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. And then there's a third wave that spreads out or can go to either a specific place or is broadcast throughout the brain. And it's this third wave and this, that is conscious, that at least correlates with conscious activity. And this takes several hundred milliseconds after sensory input, 300 to 500 milliseconds, up to a half a second. And then bing occurs. So it takes 300 to 500 milliseconds for this before this activity occurs. And yet we often respond to visual inputs in less than 100 milliseconds, seemingly consciously. Now, not even great athletes like Rafael Nadal have this ability. We all do. If we're at a cocktail party or talking, having a conversation back and forth, we will respond to whatever the other person says. I or you or any of us will respond before that activity that they said is processed in our brain according to measurements. And because of this, neuroscience and philosophy consider consciousness epiphenomenal, means that we're strictly consciousness is along for the ride. And because of this problem, and therefore consciousness doesn't really exist in terms of free will and having control. And this is the basis for Dan Dennett's philosophy, that consciousness happens too late, and we have this multiple drafts, and consciousness is really what we remember, what we think we remember. So there's a way around this, but it involves quantum mechanics, and I'll come back to that point. But we know this for a number of reasons, including the fact that only the third wave is inhibited by anesthesia, selectively preventing consciousness. And this work was done by George Mashour's group at the University of Michigan, and George will be here this week. Maybe he's here now. This is very interesting. And only the third wave is inhibited. And so the question is, what's so special about the third wave? Now, the waves 1 and 2 remain intact. And in fact, we monitor wave 2. We monitor wave 2 in anesthesia for spinal cord surgery. So if the surgeons are operating on the spinal cord, we want to make sure the signals are getting through. So we're monitoring the brain up here, and yet the patient's unconscious. So wave 2 is intact. Wave 3, if you take it away, that gets rid of consciousness, even though it happens late. And this is consistent with, these 3 waves are consistent with the various theories of consciousness, including integrated information theory, which broadcasts to apparently the posterior part of the brain, global neuronal workspace, which is this broadcast predictive coding and recurrent processing, which is kind of 2 rubbing against 3 or feedback between the 2 of them, and higher order thought from PFC elsewhere. And in ORC-OR, our theory, it's consistent with all of them, whether any of them are true or not, because consciousness is happening at a deeper level. And I'll come back to that point. Also, Libet's 1979 experiments on neuronal adequacy which showed that you need 500 milliseconds of neural activity to have consciousness at 30 milliseconds, so the time of the evoked potential, a finding that's still being debated to this day. So the question is, what is special about the third wave? Well, the third wave of activity enters the cortex and also requires 3 waves. The thalamic inputs, for example, go to layer 4, and from layer 4, they go to layer 1, 2, 3, and 6. And from there, they converge onto layer 5 pyramidal cells, shown here. And the layer 5 pyramidal cells are the most likely place for consciousness for a number of reasons. And they're important because, for one thing, the apical dendrites that arise from the pyramidal cells give rise to EEG. So anything we measure from the scalp or the top of the brain is actually coming from these ascending apical dendrites, because they're all in parallel and they don't cancel out. And the basilar dendrites connect to form a web across the entire cortex of pyramidal cells. And Carl Pribram suggested that dendritic interactions between in these basilar dendrites gave rise to interference patterns and some kind of hologram which generated consciousness. And finally, the output of these pyramidal cells go downward to the spinal cord, into the pyramidal tract of the spinal cord for direct motor behavior. So this controls behavior coming out of this. So the pyramidal neurons in layer 5 seem to be the kind of the apex of the perception action cycle and the final arbiter of our behaviors, and trigger through the spinal cord. So this has given rise to the idea that the brain is a neuronal synaptic computer, and we have a bunch of neurons here, and this has been likened to a bunch of nodes and interconnecting pathways, like a neural network, an artificial neural network. And the brain is seen as a neuronal synaptic computer based on Hodgkin-Huxley integrate and fire algorithmic neurons. And what this means is that in the 1950s, Hodgkin and Huxley figured out roughly, or they thought at the time, how the brain works, or how neurons work, excuse me. And we have dendrites and soma that receive synaptic inputs and integrate them through a threshold, which is regulated about here, to trigger an axonal spike or firing to the next layer of neurons. And all mediated at the membrane surface through ion channels, ignoring anything that goes on inside the neuron. And this is, so it's an algorithmic process based on equations of summating the membrane potential here to the firing threshold here, and triggering axonal spikes to the next layer. And so integrate, fire, integrate, fire, integrate, fire is the basic idea. And for the computer metaphor analogy, the firings are taking as the currency of information, ignoring all the integration and what's going on in the dendrites, which is actually much more complex and interesting. And I think it's interesting, and reducing it to a 1 or 0, a yes or no, whether this fires or not. So that allows modeling of the brain as a digital computer, with firings or spikes being the 1s or 0s, the currency. Now, this leads to an algorithmic, deterministic, machine-like system. There's no apparent place for consciousness, creativity, intuition, or insight. Accordingly, consciousness is considered epiphenomenal, and we are, as Huxley bleakly summarized, conscious automata merely helpless spectators along for the ride. And there's Pac-Man being controlled by somebody moving a joystick. And the idea is that our actions are controlled by our subconscious, our autopilot. And it's true that, you know, when we do things like driving to work the same way every day, that we're not necessarily conscious of the road until something happens. We might be daydreaming about what we're going to do when we get there. And so it's not that inconceivable that we might be helpless spectators, at least some of the time. But I think to generalize and say that's the case all the time is at least potentially wrong. However, to get around this problem of real-time conscious control being happening before the inputs causing that response are processed requires some funny business with quantum mechanics. And this will be discussed by Roger Penrose in his plenary talk on Thursday morning about backward time effects. And in quantum mechanics, that's permissible. And I actually, using Roger's ideas, I wrote about this in 2012, how quantum brain biology can rescue conscious free will. So 2 questions. Are neurons really simple threshold logic devices, 1 or 0, which is how neuroscience and philosophy and AI people kind of look at this? In other words, is the brain really a complex computer of simple neurons? It's hard to believe that that's the case, that a neuron is simply an on-off state, because if you consider a single cell paramecium and some of the other organisms that Dante was talking about, the single cell paramecium can learn, avoid predators, find food, find a mate, and have sex without any synapses. It's one cell. And so here we see a paramecium bouncing off something going the other direction. If you suck it into a capillary tube, it escapes faster each time. And here are 2 paramecium fused during sex. So this is kind of a X-rated cartoon here. And we don't know if they are conscious or not, but it is true that paramecium are only still when they're fused and mating. They're absolutely still for a minute or 2. And that might avoid decoherence and allow some kind of quantum effect. But we don't really know that. But all these activities have purposes. And as I mentioned before, it's my bias that there's some kind of rudimentary consciousness driving behavior even at these simple levels. Now, how do they do this? They don't have a nervous system. A lot of the organisms that Dante showed don't have nervous systems, but they do have microtubules, and plants have microtubules, and even archaebacterium and prokaryotes have something like microtubules, simpler forms, not as advanced as ours. But paramecium in particular have cilia, and that's how the cilia are these little things that stick out. You can almost barely see them there. And here we see a better view of a paramecium and the cilia sticking out. And if we do a cross section through one cilium, we see that it's made of 9 pairs of microtubules with a central core. And here's a cilium coming out of a cell. And here's the centriole, which is part of the mitotic spindle structure, or mitosis in cell division, which is very similar with triplets instead of doublets. And these guys are also detect photons. And Dante mentioned the Cambrian evolutionary explosion. There was big, a lot of cilia appeared at that time. And I think a lot of photo detection first appeared. So these things, which also stick out of cells, including neurons, can detect photons, and they're also found in every rod and cone cell in our eye. And so they may be detecting optical information. So how does a cilia move? in an organized fashion. Well, it turns out that it uses these motor proteins, which dynein, which use ATP to contract. And so they contract in a coordinated fashion so the cilia can bend in an organized way as opposed to spasmodic and disorganized. And if it bumps into something and causes it to bend, then it transmitted a signal. So a biologist named Jelle Atema in 1974 suggested there were propagating signals along the microtubule that triggered this dynein, then this dynein, then this dynein to contract. And that allowed the cilia to bend in an organized fashion. Well, it turns out that these same structures organize interiors of brain neurons. So here's a brain neuron. It could be a pyramidal cell. Here's the axon going this way. And in the dendrite, here's one microtubule. And the motor proteins, here's the dynein we saw in cilia, and here's the kinesin. And it is signaled to jump off and deliver its cargo by placement of tau proteins, microtubule associated protein tau at specific places on the microtubule lattice. Travis Craddock showed a slide of this morning. And tau is also known in Alzheimer's disease when you get too much tau accumulates in the corner of the cell. And so because the problem is that for synaptic plasticity, if you have a synapse here, or a synapse here or here, the motor proteins have to know where to jump off and deliver their cargo. How do they know that? Well, it turns out it looks like the placement of the tau on the microtubule is a signal. So the precise placement is a form of memory or encoding, and suggesting that microtubules may encode information. And there's a lot of other information, a lot of other evidence for that, as we'll come to. Now, if the microtubules disassemble and fall apart, you get Alzheimer's disease. And here's the tau that's fallen off. Here it is when it's still on board. And whether the microtubule disassembles first and then the tau falls off, or the tau falls off and then the microtubule disassembles, we're not sure, since the tau stabilizes. And the neuron gets all lumpy and misshapen and doesn't function very well. And eventually you lose microtubules and you lose neuron and you lose synapses, and you get dementia, and you lose memory, and you lose eventually consciousness, but first cognition. There are a lot of other diseases of the cytoskeleton in the brain. For example, schizophrenia. Well, here's a microtubule, and here's a motor protein delivering a protein called CRMP2, which is important for proper bundling of actin. Actin is another cytoskeletal protein that keeps the microtubules in normal, proper morphology, as we see here. But in schizophrenia, apparently there's a problem with the transport of CRMP2, the transport mechanism, and you get dispersed and disorganized actin, and you get misshapen and swollen and abnormal neuronal shape, which correlate with schizophrenia. And there's an excellent article came out in 2016 of almost every psychiatric illness that has a biological basis seems to have problems with the cytoskeleton one way or another. For example, if patients are depressed and they take Prozac, it takes a couple of weeks for the Prozac to work because the microtubules inside the dendrites and soma have to reorganize, and that takes a couple of weeks. So that could be the delay in the onset of antidepressant effects of SSRIs like Prozac. Now, what about larger scales, or what about microtubules in general? Here's a synapse, an axon, dendrite, dendritic spine, dendrite, And here are the microtubules, which are these cylindrical polymers made up of individual proteins called tubulin that can process information. There's a sequence of 4, and here's 4 different patterns based on the protofilaments. And in the 1980s, there was this sort of prototypical computer game called the Game of Life, a cellular automata put forth by Martin Gardner, where you had a grid and every square could be alive or dead, depending on the number of neighbors at a subsequent, at discrete time intervals. And these patterns moved through the lattice and could do all kinds of interesting computations and information processing. And in 1990, Steen Rasmussen and I and others, Steen's sitting here in the front row and will speak on Thursday. Steen and his physicist colleagues modeled microtubule automata and found propagating patterns that moved and could process information, and then he actually hooked up 2 microtubules and showed that they could learn. So that work showed that microtubules can process information and propagate patterns and could essentially do computation. So I had gotten interested in microtubules in 1980, well, around 1982, and published a paper in Journal of Theoretical Biology, then wrote a book, and then met Steen, and he did put it on another level in terms of modeling and information processing, and Jack Tuszynski and Travis Craddock and others. And then in the mid 90s with Roger Penrose, quantum computing models. So the point is that there's a potential for information processing within neurons or within all living cells, which might explain why some of the organisms that Dante was showing don't have nervous systems, but are still pretty clever and pretty capable of doing things. So this, considering microtubule information processing, raised the bar for the brain computational capacity. In the 80s and even still today, a lot of people follow the AI singularity idea of roughly 10 to the 11th neurons, each with 1,000 synapses, each with 100 hertz, 10 to the 16th operations per second per brain. So Kurzweil and others would say, and actually Hans Moravec said it first in '86, once we get to 10 to the 16th operations per second, we'll have brain equivalents in a computer, and it can do anything that the brain can do, including consciousness. Well, I think that that goal has long been passed, and as far as we can tell, computers aren't conscious. And in the 80s, I was going around being a nuisance to AI people saying, no, your goalpost is much further down, because if you consider microtubule computation, you have about 1 billion tubulins per neuron oscillating in megahertz, and 100 megahertz, 10 megahertz, for example. This gives you 10 to the 16th operations per second per neuron, or 10 to the 27th operations per second per brain. And this would push the goalpost for AI way downstream. And so they didn't like that very much. And I became an annoyance. But let me deal with memory, and then we'll come back to this point. So memory was mentioned, and embedded intelligence, in my opinion, implies active memory. And now most people in neuroscience would say that memory involves synaptic plasticity, and it's based on long-term potentiation, this model system. So you have the axon and the dendrite, and when there's activity across the synapse, the receptors activated and ions flow through, including calcium. And calcium, among other things, activates this enzyme called CAMK2, calcium calmodulin kinase 2, which is a hexagonal holoenzyme which binds to microtubules and and does something that results in memory. Well, CAMK2 turns out to be this hexagonal snowflake-shaped molecule, which when calcium comes in, extends these six kinase domains above and below the holoenzyme into this, including phosphorylation sites. And what happens? That was the question. And when I saw this, I wondered what was being phosphorylated inside the neuron that could store memory. And because of the hexagonal shape, I wondered whether it was microtubules. And so I asked my friend Travis, I just saw him a few minutes ago, I don't know if he's still here, and the enzyme, to see if the enzyme fit the geometry and the size of the A lattice or the B lattice in microtubule. And sure enough, it fit perfectly with a little stretch in the kinase domain. It could fit the A lattice or the B lattice. And more also, the phosphorylation sites could reach the tubulin and phosphorylate up to 6 tubulins with every encounter. So what we proposed is that the holoenzyme, the CAMK2, lands and can phosphorylate up to 6 bits of information at a time and then go on its merry way. And this would result in memory being encoded to maybe bind tau or bind a microtubule associated protein or govern dynein or something like that. So encoding information in as memory in the microtubule. Well, it turns out that, so you could ask, well, what's the memory capacity at this level? And it's ginormous. I don't even know how to describe it, because each tubulin in the brain can have one of 17 different genetic isozymes in the brain. In other tissues, there's fewer. There's maybe 11 in thyroid, for example. And there's also up to 5 different post-translational modifications. This has been these post-translational modifications, which involve removal or addition of an amino acid, has been called the tubulin code by Janke, I think his name is, and and phosphorylation sites. So this means, by my very rough math, each tubulin, there's about 1 billion, can have 2 times 10 to the 22nd possible states, so that each microtubule is a mosaic or a heterogeneous mosaic with enormous amounts of information. So also, neurons don't divide. So in all other cells, the microtubules have to, when the cell's going to divide, they disassemble, tubulins reassemble as mitotic spindles. They pull the chromosomes apart. Then in the daughter cells, they go back to doing what they're supposed to be doing. Well, any relationship between the tubulins in the lattice would be lost. But neurons don't divide. So once they're set up, the mosaic can stay permanent and they're capped at both ends. So there's no what's called treadmilling, where you add at one end and take it off at the other. And so memory can be stored for the lifetime of the organism. If you go back to the synapse, the synaptic plasticity idea, those proteins are only there for hours to days. They're recycled, and yet memories can last lifetimes. So I think memory is encoded in the microtubules, and the capacity at the level of tubulins in the human brain, 10 to the 11th neurons, is 10 to the 11th times 10 to the 9th times 2 times 10 to the 22nd, I think. So that's all I know, is that's a very big number, and but it's roughly the memory capacity of our brain at this level. Whether it's true or not, I'm not sure, but let's just, and certainly you'd want a lot of redundancy and so forth. But there's a lot of memory storage there. And embedded intelligence implies that processes mediating consciousness would operate efficiently in a medium, for example, microtubules, in which memory was embedded. because the view now, as I understand it, in terms of memory, is that you're doing something in the cortex. Then when you need memory, you got to go find it somewhere else. Although memory is clearly stored in cortex also. You got to be in touch with the hippocampus or this or that. But if you're doing whatever consciousness is, whether it's a objective reduction or some kind of quantum state, if it's happening in the same medium where the memory is, that would make it very convenient. And reminds me of Marshall McLuhan's idea, the medium is the message. So we can then ask where in the brain might that occur? And I go back to the pyramidal cells, as I mentioned before, because they seem to be the most likely place for consciousness in the brain. Not any one particular part of the cortex, but anywhere in the cortex, whichever ones happen to be doing the proper processing, which I think would be a quantum process. And if we look inside the pyramidal cells, we see the microtubules, and the microtubules shown here. I've shown you pictures of that before. And these are the origin of EEG. And what might we look for as evidence for consciousness? And it could be a deviation from algorithmic behavior, deviation from Hodgkin-Huxley algorithmic behavior in pyramidal neurons of awake animals. And sure enough, in 2006, Nondorf et al. Did a study and showed that there was deviation. So, but here's what Hodgkin-Huxley would predict with integrate and fire. You'd have a very narrow threshold, voltage threshold for firing, and a very narrow temporal window for firing. And the firings would be slanted because you'd expect for sequential opening of these ion channels. So narrow, constant threshold, algorithmic. However, in awake animals, and they did this in cats while they were awake, and they found instead a very wide threshold and a very wide temporal window, and the spikes were vertical, perpendicular, presumably because these ion channels were opening simultaneously, more like a quantum effect. They were all connected, interconnected or entangled or something. But some factor other than the membrane, than the integrated threshold potential was causing deviation from Hodgkin-Huxley behavior. This would be the ideal place for consciousness to come in to cause deviation from algorithmic behavior, deviation from Hodgkin-Huxley. This is where consciousness could regulate behavior inside neurons. Because if it was coming from outside, it would affect the membrane potential, and we'd see it in the integrated dendritic potential. So if it's inside, well, here's the dendrite. Here are the microtubules and the dendrite. Here are the microtubules and the axon, where they're continuous, whereas in dendrites and soma, they're interrupted. They're actually the same size. Imagine these are further back. And so it could be that consciousness is happening in the dendrites and the microtubules and the dendrites and soma, influencing the firing and controlling behavior or modulating behavior by modulating the firing of the axon. This is something like deep learning networks in AI. And one of the great advances in the last few decades in AI has been deep learning neuronal networks. So we start with a simple neural network, and we have an input layer, a hidden layer, and an output layer. And if we add some more hidden layers, we get interesting behavior. These provide novel aspects to cognitive perceptions suggestive of psychedelic states. And for example, if you have a hidden layer, if the outer layer, first layer is looking at a plate of spaghetti and one of the hidden layers has puppy dogs in it, you get a plate of spaghetti that has puppy dogs in it. And people have made notice that this is something like a psychedelic state. This work was done by Anil Seth in the UK. And similarly, you can have eyeballs popping up here, there, and everywhere. So this additional hidden layer may be happening, maybe what's happening in the brain in terms of deeper layers, particularly in a psychedelic condition. So, however, the hidden layers in AI are the same scale and they're connected serially. So what I'm suggesting is that microtubules inside brain neurons act like a hidden layer at a smaller, faster scale, very much like embedded intelligence. So these would be deeper, faster quantum processes occurring in the cytoskeleton. So, well, here's two layers. Here's the neural level. Here's the microtubule level. But then you go down into tubulin level and smaller and smaller that I'll get to in a little bit. And so this is very much like it seems like a hierarchical system. And most people would agree, neuroscientists would agree that in EEG, for example, if you go from the level of neuron, here's the pyramidal neuron, upward, larger networks, larger and larger networks, then you do see a kind of a fractal 1/f hierarchy with cell-similar patterns repeating. But it also should go down into the networks of microtubules, microtubule, the rows of tubulins, and then even smaller into tubulin, these dipole oscillations within tubulin, atomic nucleus, and then according to Penrose, all the way down to fundamental space-time geometry, which would be the ultimate site for embedded intelligence or embedded consciousness even, or what Roger called platonic values that might influence might influence conscious perceptions and actions. So if you put it all together, it's 15, just within the brain, 15 orders of magnitude. And there's actually evidence for this. This is from the work of Anirban Bandyopadhyay, who looked at neurons. Here's neurons, one neuron, here's two with these nanoprobes, and then looked at one individual microtubule with 4 electrodes, and then looked at rows of the tubulins. And in all of them, if you apply alternating current, they tend to be insulators. But if you sweep the alternating current that you're applying, you will find certain frequencies where the microtubule or the tubulin becomes very conductive, almost superconductive, ballistic conductance it's called. And so these are plots of conductance at particular applied frequencies. So if we start at the small scale, terahertz, individual tubulins, we get terahertz, gigahertz, megahertz. And then if we go up to the individual microtubules, we get the gigahertz, megahertz, kilohertz. And if we go to the whole neurons, we get the megahertz, kilohertz, and hertz. And in all cases, the peaks were what Anirban called triplets of triplets. And triplets of triplets here. So each of these spikes, each of these peaks, conductance peaks, is a triplet of triplets. And you see it at every one. And recently, Anirban has been telling me that they are now able to measure from the scalp, measure EEG at much faster frequencies, including megahertz. They can now measure apparently megahertz from the scalp with EEG, and they do see these triplets of triplets. This hasn't been published yet. They've seen it in animals, and they're starting human studies. So within a year, we may find out more about that. And it could be that there are these faster and faster frequencies of EEG going all the way down into terahertz. So we have this multi-scale, scale invariant hierarchy, you might say. So going back to the brain computational capacity, even adding the microtubules, that doesn't explain consciousness. Where's the being? what else may be required. And I'm not going to talk about the quantum stuff too much because it's not that. I think we can have embedded intelligence with or without quantum. But I do want to mention that when I was being a pest to the AI people, finally somebody said, well, how would that explain consciousness, even with all this extra information processing? And I had to admit I didn't know, but he suggested I read this book, The Emperor's New Mind by Roger Penrose, which argued for a non-computable effect, backward time effects, and a connection of consciousness to the fundamental level of the universe. So I'm still not an expert in quantum mechanics. I don't know anybody who really is, maybe Roger and a few other people. But I can tell you that in a simple way that there's two, the world is divided into the quantum and classical realms. And in the quantum world, we have quantum superposition, which is non-local, wave-like, and small. And in our classical world, we have classical, localized, particle-like, and large. And there's several aspects of quantum that can help explain consciousness. For example, the unitary nature of cognitive binding and sense of self due to quantum coherence and entanglement. So that solves the binding problem. For example, in visual processing, shape, color, motion, meaning are processed at different times, different areas, and yet we see one unitary object. We don't see first its shape, then its color, then its motion, and its meaning. We just see, aha, it's an airplane or it's a bird. So that's called, and we have one sense of self. So this could be quantum coherence and entanglement, like a Bose-Einstein condensate. If you perturb one aspect of it, you perturb the whole thing. Also, the abrupt transition from unconscious, subconscious possibilities to consciousness and causal selection of actions and perceptions as quantum state reduction, collapse of the wave function, or Penrose objective reduction. Dante mentioned the idea that I put in a paper called The Quantum Origin of Life, that these objective reductions were happening before life, and including in the primordial soup, either on Earth or elsewhere. And these began to organize and have very primitive feelings. And these feelings could have prompted the origin of life as a feedback fitness function to optimize pleasure. Because as I said, in animals and even plants, well, I can't really say for plants, but in animals, pleasure is what drives, reward is what drives behavior. And it's also true that in Dante's area, there are molecules. Well, I'll come back to that in a second. I'm going to talk about that. The other thing, the hard problem of phenomenal experience as an intrinsic feature of space-time geometry. And I say that because many neuroscientists have given up on the hard problem and now rely on panpsychism, that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe. Or matter, I should say. But even more primitive than matter would be quantum state reduction, which gives rise to matter or gives rise to particular states of matter. And that real-time conscious action is dependent on quantum backward time effects and temporal non-locality. And Roger will talk about that on Thursday. I should say that his view is that consciousness kind of is on the edge, the boundary between quantum and classical. And this is actually in the Kabbalah says that there are two realms and consciousness dances on the edge between the two worlds. But technological quantum computers require temperatures near absolute zero to avoid disruption by thermal decoherence. And our critics for many years said that biology is too warm, wet, and noisy for seemingly delicate quantum effects. However, the answer, I think, is in organic chemistry. And organic chemistry started in the 18th century. Chemists knew about the hydrocarbons, alkanes and alkenes, with these formulas CnH2n plus 2 or CnH2n. But they had a molecule called C6H6 that was oily and highly flammable, and they didn't know its structure. And Kepler had a dream that the hydrocarbons were snakes, and one of them swallowed its tail, the Ouroboros, and he awoke and said, benzene, C6H6 is a ring, and there are 3 extra electron bonds shown here. And it was subsequently shown that the extra electron bonds form these delocalized clouds, pi resonance clouds, above and below the hexagon. And these resonance clouds are conducive to quantum effects. They support electric and magnetic dipole oscillations and so forth. And so it could be that life and consciousness derive from pi resonance in biomolecules, including those in molecules like this, very complex organic molecules, in interstellar dust and in molecule and in throughout the universe, and including in meteors and asteroids that bring these molecules to Earth. Or in the case of Dante's asteroid, he sent a probe to scoop some up. We'll hear about that on Thursday. But these pi resonance groups are interesting because they're nonpolar and uncharged and chemically inert almost, but they induce dipoles in each other, induced dipoles, which then oscillate in terahertz. And this gives rise to oscillations and quantum computing, perhaps, which are necessary for consciousness, we suggest. And anesthesia blocks these dipole oscillations, causing the lack of consciousness. And psychoactive molecules, dopamine, serotonin, and psychedelics, LSD, DMT, psilocybin, all have these pi resonance aromatic groups. And we'll hear more about these on Wednesday in particular. They also form proteins. Oil and water don't mix. So if you have a ring, aromatic pi resonance ring with a polar tail, these are called amphipathic molecules, and these were shown to be produced, at least in principle, in the primordial soup. The non-polar groups align and form a nonpolar interior core with a polar exterior, and these are called operin micelles, and were thought to be the basis for early cells. And proteins form and fold like this. But also lipid bilayers and nucleic acids have an internal pi resonance core. So there's this quantum underground, a term coined by Travis and our group, pervading living systems. So deep within biology, despite it being warm, wet, and noisy, there's a quantum-friendly region deep within these biomolecules. And we know they can mediate quantum spin transfer increased by temperature, and through these quantum dots, these sawtooth waves showing that. And the 2D electron spectroscopy of this photosynthesis FMO protein generates these sawtooth patterns suggesting quantum states. And most recently, Travis's group has found super radiance and subradiance states in microtubule. This is a schematic of a microtubule. So let me conclude with 3 points. I didn't cover too much. I didn't really mention the polyaromatic hydrocarbons in the interstellar dust that I hope Dante will talk about, that could also be the origin of life and consciousness. But as far as embedded intelligence, I think it implies that processes occur across different scales in a scale invariant hierarchy. And I think life and consciousness both involve a scale invariant, meaning self-similar patterns at repeating scales from at least from the nanoscale on upward to EEG. Conscious processes can occur in memory that's already embedded. So it's already operating in a medium that includes information. And embedded intelligence may be useful in understanding how the brain produces consciousness, including delving deeper into scales in the quantum realm, for example, in our Orca theory. Thank you very much.
Sort of to recap your embedded intelligence. We started with the universe in its primordialness, whatever associations with Big Bangs, plural or whatever. We have a physical universe. We create the 98 stable elements. We have biochemistry. We have evolution. We have consciousness. We have embedded intelligence, and we have awareness of this consciousness. So we have a level 5 in the brain that is an integrative level from thalamic inputs, except for olfaction. Is there a sampling mechanism in the brain that compares the various states of the level 5 being, its awareness? Is that consciousness awareness? In other words, is it a comparator that something has changed in the level 5 from some input, and then the attention comparator then says, ah, this is consciousness of the internal milieu or your sight or your feelings? And how does anesthesia and hypnosis work in that?
How many questions was that? That's all right. Well, first of all, let me just pick out a few. I think Roger has this idea that Platonic values are embedded in the fine scale structure of the universe. And, we don't really know what the universe is made of, particularly at the Planck scale, at its most fundamental level. But he is the world's expert. And he's got, various models, twistor theory and spin networks and whatnot. And so, there is some structure and patterns there that could encode information and that could percolate through this hierarchy to influence our thoughts and decisions. The first type of consciousness that would occur just due to objective reductions occurring in the primordial soup or in the environment or anywhere would be random and disconnected, and therefore what he calls proto-conscious. And then when we get into biological systems, they self-organize to optimize pleasure, I'm suggesting, and eventually and drive evolution. So in my view, I'm not disagreeing with Darwin at all. I'm disagreeing with what's his name, Dawkins, who says that the purpose is to gene survival. I think that unless genes have feelings, I don't see how that makes any sense at all. So I think evolution is to optimize pleasure. Now, it could be hedonistic pleasure, it could be altruistic pleasure, spiritual pleasure, any kind of pleasure, avoiding displeasure. So that's what I think has been driving evolution. So I think consciousness preceded evolution and is actually driving it. So to go from proto-consciousness to optimal consciousness and so forth. Now, when you get into the comparator and you're getting into sense of self, that's pretty far along. And I think we got a long way to go before we worry about that. So, Julian Jaynes's book, The Origin of, The Origin of Consciousness, The Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, he suggested that prior to a few 100,000 years ago, we didn't have a sense of self. We had a bunch of voices in our heads telling us what to do. And that could be, there are people like that today, schizophrenic people and so forth. So that could be. So the sense of self, that sort of thing, I think comes later. And I'm not saying it's an easy problem, but compared to why there's any consciousness at all, it's relatively easy.
Thanks for your presentation. Really appreciate it. You'd mentioned earlier that in the identification of intelligence that a paramecium can be identified as being intelligent, and a paramecium can make decisions and actions and such, and that part of that intelligence could arise from the microtubules in the cilia. And that in the Cambrian explosion, that many forms of organisms arrived that had cilia, and that could be driving forces of their intelligence. So I'm curious then, as humans, and we have hair on our body, and that kind of our form of cilia on our membrane, might it be that consciousness is a coordination between the microtubules of our brain within our neurons of our head, in coordination with microtubules throughout the entire system structure that would include the membrane and the hairs and the microtubules plausibly in the hairs of our skin? And back to my earlier question of this whole membrane system as being the conscious kind of organizing structure, and the brain being very highly, maybe the single most important unit, but it's secondary to the whole system. I was kind of curious if you'd riff on that.
Well, I don't know about hair because for one thing, I don't have any. But it's not motor. I don't see my hairs, pushing bugs off my arm. They're there for other reasons. So I don't think that's a good analogy. But the cilia and the centrioles, I think, are key. For example, the centrioles, which are basically two cilia-like at perpendicular angles, in pyramidal cells, one of them actually grows through the membrane, accompanied by membrane, and sticks up, called the primary cilium, which may be an antenna of some sort even for photons, since the cilia do seem to detect photons, and more evidence shows that there are photons in the brain. So I'm not sure about the hair analogy, but I think cilia and centrioles are key.
Are those structures within the humans?
Pardon me?
Are those structures within the humans?
Within humans?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And where
primary cilia? Look them up.
Okay.
Hi, Stu. It's a real treat to be able to ask you a question in person. I'd read Shadows of the Mind when I was a teenager, so being here is fun for me.
Roger wrote that, though, not me.
Yeah, no, I know, but it led me to the papers that you guys wrote together and try to figure out what the hell you were talking about for decades. So it's fun to listen to you talk about it directly. Yeah, you talk about the deviation from the Hodgkin-Huxley behavior as evidence that there's some sort of quantum effect happening inside the cell to coordinate, these membrane actions. But we heard earlier today, Travis talk about microdomains that act as the rafts around an ion channel. And
the lipid rafts?
Yep, a microdomain. And a microdomain is enriched in certain types of phospholipids, in gangliosides, sialicides, charge-carrying molecules. They know that coordinated behavior across that membrane can lead to a Debye layer with a tightly held ion layer. Is it possible that there are also quantum effects happening at that interfacial boundary across the surface of the cell that are involved in that behavior that you were describing?
I think the quantum effects are in the nonpolar regions. And when you're in ions, when you have a bunch of ions, the charges, it's too warm, wet, and noisy to coin the term that the critics turned against us. We avoided that problem by saying we think the quantum effects are in where anesthesia acts, according to the Meyer-Overton correlation, in nonpolar lipid-like regions. So within the lipid rafts, yeah, maybe, but in the ions, I'm not so sure.
I'm not talking about, I'm talking about in the ionic glycolipids that are there, not in the, like, in the, you know, the metal ions that are shielding them, but within the actual acidic charge carrying glycolipid rafts, the microdomains around the ion channels.
I don't know. You know, there people now are talking about these radical ion pairs can form quantum, can have quantum effects, and they're important in bird navigation and magnetoreception. And a paper just came out 2 days ago from Christoph Simon talking about a radical ion pair in microtubules as a quantum effect. So I prior to seeing that paper, I would have said no, but now I'm going to read that paper and that might have the answer. If you can have radical ion pairs, a radical ion pair mechanism in a microtubule, then maybe you could have quantum effects in an ionic medium with charge, but I don't know. All righty. Thank you very much.
Well, wasn't that human embedded intelligence awesome? Oh my goodness. I didn't realize I'd stir up so much stuff. Well, I wanted to say that when before we start our little exchange here, basically when I interpret what Dante and Stuart have been saying, I filter it through the idea that we have an amazing processing system, an amazing information system that has evolved out of whatever it started with. And that's why I go back to energy and intelligence, and I just make it very simple, but I can tell I've really oversimplified it compared to what I just heard. So I've never been experiencing all these wonderful concepts and ideas that through science we've discovered. So I guess now, are we going to have this microphone? Okay, so Dante and I probably talked about 2 hours last night on various aspects of the transition from abiotic to biotic. And I'm going to throw out the idea that everything is quantum and that the intelligence gathers the portions of the quantum energy forms to build from the bottom up. And the transition from abiotic to biotic is, I could throw out the idea, just imagine quanta that wants to be part of the atomic structure that's hanging out saying, what am I got to do?
The one thing that strikes me when you think through these theories and the fundamental connections to space-time and embedded intelligence at the atomic scale, it's why isn't it everywhere? Why isn't all matter doing what we're doing in this room right now? Why do at least most things we see, I guess they haven't gotten bored yet, maybe, right? They're still waiting for that moment to occur. But what happened here on this planet to give not only the abiotic to biotic transition, but then the develop of neural systems and consciousness, or at least the orchestrated consciousness that Stuart and Roger would propose. Something special is here, right? Something distinct. And as far as we know, and people in my community are, starting to think desperately about where it might else be in the solar system, where it might be in the galaxy. Why isn't it here? What was the limitation to Mars or to Europa or to Titan to the other places in the solar system even that look like they should be relatively hospitable to life, if not now, in the past.
Okay, well, I would say it has to do with H2O. I think it has to have a mobility. I think it has to be able to be dynamic. It has to move around. I mean, look at, we don't want to sit still, right? I mean, I'm scaling it from the atomic structures that found a way to exist. And actually, when you think of a hydrogen atom as a proton and electron, then somehow they figured out how to get together. They fell in love. And so they wanted to hang out. And so then along comes an oxygen atom. Somehow they gathered up. They decided to build other atomic structures. So I'm saying I don't have the answers to the specifics like maybe you can find or some other scientists can find. I'm throwing out the idea that intelligence, and I go to the idea that intelligence senses, process what was sensed, communicates within itself. Like for instance, if you want to go to the quantum energy level that's going to build a proton, it has to say, well, I'm done building myself. I'm complete. And so then it's happy. And that's the proton's way of saying, I'm done, I'm happy, and I don't need to do anything else. I'm okay the way I am. The same with the electron. And I'm saying that's kind of a very simplistic way of looking at it. But I say if you start with that idea and then you go to a Stuart level or a Dante level, I mean, look at the complexities that are sitting up here next to me. I mean, the amount of information they have stored, and then they can recall it. I mean, that's just amazing. And so there you have it.
Okay. So another thought I had after Bill and then Stuart, because it gets to consciousness versus embedded intelligence, right? I've kind of been the one in between these two guys. Stuart's Mr. Consciousness and Bill's Mr. Embedded Intelligence. And I'm trying to understand, does any of this have anything to do with astrobiology and the origin of life, which is where my interests are at the moment. And I was struck by Stuart's discussion of algorithmic decision-making, right? Intelligence is very algorithmic. It makes a decision that's deterministic, whereas consciousness, the way I interpreted it and even told to Kate, can make bad decisions, right? We can make the wrong decision and we do it willfully, sometimes gleefully, because we'll get pleasure out of it, even though we know it's the wrong decision to make. Do you see a distinction there in embedded intelligence versus consciousness in the nature of the decision and the fact that you can actually make a decision against what logic and algorithm would say is the right one?
Well, I've made a lot of dumb decisions, that's for sure. But I think it involves, hunches, intuition, insight, gut feelings. If you want to believe in divine guidance, following the way of the Tao, that could all be platonic values. It could be more simpler, just a deeper level with more knowledge and on which to make decisions. But if it could just go to the level of microtubules and that was it. But if Roger's right, and he has the only mechanism I've ever heard proposed to solve the hard problem of having an experience based on quantum state reduction, then it would go further than that to the fine scale structure of the universe, and that gets even more interesting, even although complicated.
So I'm throwing out the idea that we have a language problem. When we talk about consciousness, are we really wanting to talk about human related consciousness? In other words, I'm throwing out the idea that consciousness for me means that it can self-assemble. So that means that when you have an atomic structure, it can self-assemble. So then we just scale it to our individual human forms. But when we think of it as consciousness, it has to be self-consciousness to stop gathering quantum energy when it's completed its gathering of that as a proton. I'm taking it really down to that level. And I think when you take it down to that level and then bring it up to a Stuart level, I don't know that Stuart will ever be done gathering information. I think he's going to continue doing that. And I think Dante will, and I intend to. But when I got to the embedded intelligence and started talking with Ted, who's a philosophy professor, or he's retired now, but he was probing, and I don't know that we'll have time to play the video, but he took about 17 years to ask me 17 years worth of questions, and he still has more left, but he's now using the embedded intelligence idea. And when Andrew Maynard introduced me to the bounded infinity idea, and he introduced it as odd numbers are a bounded infinity because you never run into an even number. Likewise, even numbers are a bounded infinity. And you can imagine other bounded infinities. Well, I was imagining a human bounded infinity, and I couldn't wait to get that idea back to Ted. Now he's contemplating the idea of a human bounded infinity is a values neutral foundation for moral, political, and social theory. So when we talk about consciousness, I'd like to think of it going all the way back to the photon. And I wanted to throw out something. I threw out the language thing. And so languages are interesting. And when we're trying to communicate or wanting to communicate with something out there outside of our solar system or even in the solar system, I'm throwing out the idea, are we sending entangled photons out to the universe so that we can actually change the entangled photon we keep here to out there? Because it's going to take at least 4.5 years to get to the first star at the speed of light. And so you can't wait around for 9 years. I mean, how many times are we going to send a message before we say the groceries are bad?
So practically, we are not sending entangled photons out to Alpha Centauri, which is the star that's 4.5 light years away, because somebody'd have to be monitoring the other one, I guess, all the time, right? And we don't have a budget for that. So that's the engineering side of the business. I also don't think the entanglement survives that distance, but I'm not sure. I'm not an expert in quantum photon entanglement, but I don't know if you send an entangled photon out into the universe, would it stay entangled with the one you kept back on Earth? That's an interesting question for somebody like Roger or right, somebody in the quantum realm that understands those kinds of things. Any thoughts on that, Stuart?
No.
Or
let me just say that I think we need entanglement within the brain just for normal brain function, like binding and to avoid the consciousness coming too late, that sort of thing. I think there's quantum entanglement within the brain, and if that's the case, it probably also out of the brain. But I got enough problems to defend.
Well, I think if you look at what we just heard from Stuart and Dante, isn't Earth a really special place? I mean, if we communicate with something that's 10,000 light years away, it'll be a long time before we get the message back, right? And then we want to get in a conversation. That's kind of a funny thing to do. But that tells me that right now, the wow factor right here on Earth is enough for me.
Yeah, I would agree. And when we run exoplanet surveys and design the next generation telescopes, we are looking for Earth 2.0, right? I mean, that's the goal right now. It's let's find another Earth. And part of the discussion is Earth when, right? Is it Earth 4 billion years ago when you didn't have oxygen in the atmosphere? You had carbon dioxide and single-celled organisms, maybe just invented photosynthesis, or is it Earth today? But you mentioned it before, it's H2O, it's liquid water. We think that's essential. And all of our strategies in exobiology, astrobiology are find the water, find the liquid water, because we think that's essential to any form of life. But that could be our bias, right? That's what we know, that's what's going on here. The fact that oxygen's the third most abundant element in the universe probably makes it a pretty good assumption because hydrogen's the most abundant element. So the likelihood that those two are going to get together and make water are very high. Where I have a concern is that there's a decision made to enter into that bond, as opposed to just following the chemical potential gradient to the lowest energy state, which is what systems naturally do, barring information, intelligence, or consciousness in the system.
Well, the lowest energy state is another one of those things that you can tag with intelligence. I mean, why would it go to the lowest energy state if it wasn't intelligent? I'm really a devil's advocate, if you can tell, right? But I wanted to also say that the mysteries, like the Greeks came out with gods, right? They just said, we don't understand what that bright thing is, but we'll call it a god. And so that's the way that they defined those. And then they became their own mythological construction of what we know about our world. And see, that's where I think science, and you can see the amazing amount of science that we just heard about with Stuart and Dante here, that science is trying to eliminate those mysteries. So I'm not one that's a proponent of mythologies, but I think mythologies are a good thing. And so I don't want to give up Santa Claus. And so therefore I'm saying when we have some of these disturbing things that happen in the world, which they happen a lot of times, I call that confusion. That's where the microtubules have information, but the processing is confused. And some people through traumatic experiences or other experiences that have crises in them, it ends up modifying how we process the information. So it's a combination of stored information that might be horrifying, and then processing that with now a manipulated or a confused processing element. So it comes back to information that's gathered through the senses and then processed. And sometimes it just had bogus information in there and something that causes a bad act to occur.
Okay, so that sounds like very complex information processing, if that's right, that would occur at the neural system, brain kind of level, kind of what Stuart was talking about. So that's a different level than embedded intelligence, right? Embedded intelligence is primordial in your definition, right? It's at the atomic scale or even lower at the photon scale. The photon has embedded intelligence.
Yes, the photon has an embedded intelligence, but what I'm also using, and this is where I think we have a language issue here, I'm using sense, process, communicate, and actuate at all levels, and therefore the photon says, I'm good with my quanta gravity, quanta electric, quanta magnetic, and I'm going to now fly across the universe. But it pops out of a electron changing a band is where we get some of these photons. So Stuart, going back to what you were saying, yes, and I think that orchestrated OR is something that has the potential to have the orchestrator maybe causing problems. And so I think it's a feedback system where orchestrating wanting to get the processed information to respond to the world around us can have some bad information in it.
Let me add on to that question because it's something I thought about too. From your orchestration point of view, right? We're looking what we saw this morning with Travis and the crew working on the microtubules and the photon superposition and super radiance. That's still at a very small level compared to the human conscious experience, which would involve presumably millions of neurons orchestrated coherently, right? So you've got to have many, many millions or more photons that are entering into those states across multiple nerve cells, neural cells, Have you thought about that? What does that mean in terms of orchestration? Quantum superposition seems like you'd have multiple photons, entangled photons, or multiple photons in the quantum superposition state in order to achieve that objective reduction that Roger would postulate. Is that right?
Right. So the basic equation for reduction, E sub G is the amount of superposition equals H bar over T, the time. So the larger E sub G, the faster, the smaller the T. So when we first started, we set, T equal to 25 milliseconds, as in 40 hertz EEG. The problem with that is that that's a long time to avoid environmental decoherence. And it only involves a tiny amount of the brain, like about 20 neurons worth. So that didn't really make any sense. And then we changed our, and after Honorbon's data came out, we said, well, maybe ORCO-R is happening at a much faster rate. And, but like 10 megahertz, 10 million times a second. And that would give you, that would require, you'd only have to avoid decoherence for a tiny fraction of time, which is doable, 10 to the minus 7 seconds. And we know that's okay. And that would involve about a 10,000th of the brain, 10 to the minus 15 neurons. 10 to the 15th tubulins. There's about 10 to the 20th tubulins in the brain. And so it'd be a more reasonable fraction and a very much shorter period of time. The problem there is, well, our cognitive events, cognitive scenes, epochs are hundreds of milliseconds. And so, and EEG is, 10 to 100 milliseconds. So how do you get from really fast to more brainwave type? And the answer that we came up with, actually, Roger came up with, well, how about negative resonance? And I go, well, what's negative resonance? He says, well, like beat frequencies, like in music, we have two instruments that are slightly out of sync, and they will give beats at roughly the difference between the two frequencies. So we suggested that EEG is actually a beat frequency of much faster vibrations. And that goes along with this multi-scale hierarchy or from, across scales that I showed. So that seems to be the best solution, that it's happening at, say, 10 megahertz, or it can happen at any frequency, but that resonances and beats get you slower and slower and slower as you go up in size and scale to EEG, and even slower than that above EEG. So does that answer your question?
Sort of, but the conscious experience is continuous over many hours, right? We've all been in this room listening to these talks for several hours. So as you so you have to go through, you've got to go into quantum superposition and then to OR collapse and then back into superposition and OR collapse. And you've got to be, is that the frequency you're talking about? You're re-entering the quantum state, and then the reduction is occurring, and that's when the conscious moment occurs. And that's your frequency of recycling the conscious moment or refreshing the conscious moment?
Yes, because you have to do that anyway, because you have the basic problem. How do you have a quantum system that's going to interact with the classical system without being destroyed? And we actually got this idea from a sci-fi book by Paul Benioff, who was one of the inventors of quantum computing. And he had a quantum robot in there that had alternating phases of quantum classical, quantum classical, quantum classical. So during the quantum phase, it was doing quantum computation and then give an output. The output would be in the classical phase, communicate with the environment. And during that classical phase, it would have inputs. So yes, you're alternating between quantum classical, quantum, and that's the frequencies that we're talking about, including 10 megahertz. But overall, the implication is that with all these interferences and frequencies and resonances, that consciousness is more like music than a computation. And the brain's more something like a quantum orchestra, except no conductor.
Thank you. Does that fit with your embedded intelligence approach?
Yeah, it definitely does fit with the embedded intelligence. And I keep coming back to the idea that, like, for instance, quantum computing and these quantum ways of relating to intelligence is an analog. So in other words, it's between a 1 and a 0. So it's an infinite number of states that it could be in. And that when we make a good decision, we've got, I'd say, good ones. But if we make a bad decision, I'd say there's bad zeros. But anyhow, the idea that there's a quantum intelligence or a quantum use of processing within our mind, our brains, and I like to think of our minds as the information we've collected, and then our brains are actually the technology to process it, including the microtubules. Then what I'm getting at here is there's a lot of opportunity for error. There's a lot of opportunity for coming back with the wrong answer. And that's what we can see for certain people. And there's a motivation for some of us to come back with the good answers and something that we can hold our hat on. So I'd say, like, right now, when you look at the orchestrated objective reduction, then I would say that there's something going on there that says there's a will to go in one direction or another. And I don't know how to account for that other than to say we can observe it happening.
I don't know where to go from there. Go to optimize pleasure. That's a good way to end it, I think, right? All right. Thank you, Bill, for organizing and the workshop. Do you have any other topics you want to hit? We got the videos to show if you want.
Well, I do, but they'd be kind of calm compared to what you guys just talked about. The other two videos I could play, but I think what I want to do is actually give you those that want them. I think with Abby or whoever, maybe we can post them. I'd say post them. And I wanted to give you a little bit about the other two panelists that aren't available today. Andrew Maynard is trying to figure out how we can, and if you watch the video, how we can have better outcomes going forward. Because he claims that we get along and then we don't get along, and this has been going on forever. But he's looking at, and with the College of Global Futures at ASU, they're looking at, so what does it take to break that cycle of good and bad and good and bad, and why don't we just work at having a better outcomes for everything on Earth? Because Earth 2.0 is pretty far away. Wherever it is, it's pretty far away. And how do you get there anyway, right? And or is Elon Musk going to get there? And he's the only one, and a companion. I mean, there's some basic philosophical questions that I think you can arrive at. And I think you can arrive at from starting with the idea of an embedded intelligence that's in everything. It's just that we have to redefine intelligence for other layers or other complexities that we find. So Andrew Maynard is looking at how we can create better societies. Ted Humphrey, who's a philosophy professor and a philosopher, he's looking for some of those basic answers to those basic questions, such as moral theories and political theories and social theories. So he's got the big questions, but now he's starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, this idea of embedded intelligence can sort out some of the stuff that they argue about all the time. But I do want to appreciate I've been honored to be asked to put on this. I don't feel like I put on this panel discussion, this workshop. These guys did it. They did all the heavy lifting, and I got a couple of recordings that I hope you do get access to and watch them, because both Andrew and Ted are awesome, as these two are up here. And I really appreciate being part of this. And I appreciate our friendship.